Hey guys, tonight we slip into a time when the streets smell of smoke and tallow, when the night hums with distant bells, and the air tastes faintly of iron and rain. You're not standing in your bedroom anymore. You're somewhere in the middle of the 13th century, and if you breathe too loudly, someone might accuse you of sorcery or tax evasion. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry, it's only history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always wild seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander into the medieval night, the glow of torches painting the cobblestones amber. Somewhere nearby, a baker is still awake, coaxing loaves from his smoky oven. Somewhere else, a drunk knight recites Latin to a patient horse. The world is smaller and louder than you expect. Every clang of metal and murmur of rumor carries through the narrow lanes. And in those lanes live the names that history either glorified or tried very hard to forget. The first of these, most wanted. Souls is a man who probably didn't see himself as notorious at all. He was just ambitious, which in medieval terms meant likely to end up headless. You spot him in a flicker of torchlight. William the Conqueror, the Norman Duke who decided England would look better with him in charge. Historians still argue whether his invasion in 1066 was destiny or just an incredibly bold land grab. Either way, you can almost hear him muttering as he peers across the channel. I've got ships. I've got archers. What could possibly go wrong? A mainstream fact slips easily into the air. You know that after winning at Hastings, William ordered the Domesday Book, a massive survey of his new kingdom's people and property. It was medieval bureaucracy at its finest. A census so detailed that if your grand goat had been chewing someone else's hedge, it was probably listed. But here's a quirk for you. The Domesday Book's name wasn't about doom at all. It came later, when terrified peasants joked that the survey was as final as Judgment Day. Nothing escaped it. You imagine the scribes laughing nervously as they inked numbers by candlelight, their hands shaking not from fear of God, but from too much ink and too little sleep. Your feet carry you past William's shadow and into the echo of another kind of wanted man, Robin Hood. Though whether he truly existed or not is another debate that scholars still can't agree on. Some think he was a composite. Others are legends stretched from real outlaws in the Greenwood. Either way, he's the poster child of medieval rebellion, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, and somehow always having perfect aim, even without eyeglasses. The forest smells of damp moss and roasted rabbit. You can almost hear the crackle of a hidden campfire and the low murmur of laughter. An outlaw band telling stories about defying sheriffs and lords. Wanted. Their parchment posters might have read, but to the desperate peasants of Nottinghamshire, they were folk heroes. You grin to yourself. Some reputations are just better branding. As you move through the story's fog, you brush against the lives of others who danced too close to power. Take Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury who turned from the king's drinking buddy to his most irritating opponent. When Henry supposedly muttered, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took it way too literally. Becket's blood stained the cathedral floor, and for centuries afterward, pilgrims came to see where holiness and politics had violently collided. Historians still argue whether Henry truly meant to order the killing, or if it was just a royal outburst that spiraled out of control. You picture him pacing in his royal chamber afterward, realizing that in trying to get rid of one problem, he'd created a saint instead. The medieval PR department must have been working overtime. Down another cobbled path, The shadows lengthen, and you find yourself at the edge of a walled city. Constantinople, shining with oil lamps and the scent of spiced wine. Here, the Byzantine emperors ruled with an elegance that could curdle into paranoia overnight. Empress Theodora, for instance, who rose from an actress's stage to the imperial throne beside Justinian, was both adored and feared. Some accounts claim she never forgot the insults thrown at her as a performer. Others whisper she ordered those same mockers retired early. Whether she truly wielded such ruthless power or her enemies simply wrote her that way, historians, as always, still argue. In your dreamlike stroll, a laugh escapes you when you recall one odd detail. Byzantine courtiers used powdered beetles as lipstick dye. Imagine that. Centuries before influencer makeup tutorials, people were already painting confidence straight from the bug kingdom. The night hums deeper, and you catch the clatter of armor from a nearby tavern. Inside, two mercenaries are arguing about pay, while a minstrel plucks a half-tuned lute. The Middle Ages were full of these wandering blades. For hire, some noble, some reckless, all perpetually one meal away from rebellion. They drifted between lords, selling loyalty like it came in jars. If Instagram had existed, their bios would read, available for sieges, own sword, references on request. Among them might have been a figure like Bertrand du Guesclin, the Breton general known for outsmarting the English during the 100 Years' War. Not quite villain, not quite hero, just another name on the shifting list of wanted men, depending on who wrote the poster. And here's a curious tidbit. Du Guesclin supposedly had such an unremarkable face that his enemies often underestimated him. Proof that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room looks like they'd rather be napping. Outside again, you follow the moonlight up a stone hill toward a gallows silhouetted against the sky. You expect something grim, but instead find a small crowd gathered, murmuring prayers. The condemned is a woman, dressed not in rags but in armor. Joan of Arc. Calm even with firewood stacked beneath her feet. She claims to have heard voices from heaven, guiding her to save France. Whether those voices were divine, or the echo of her own burning conviction, historians still debate. A mainstream fact floats by like embers. She was just 19 when executed in 1431. A quirky footnote follows. Some of her inquisitors actually apologized mid-trial for how absurdly young she was, which is the historical equivalent of sorry, but rules are rules. You watch her eyes lift toward the stars, and for a heartbeat, the whole city seems to hold its breath. As you drift onward, the smell of smoke lingers, turning into incense as you pass a monastery. Inside, monks copy manuscripts by candlelight, their eyes bleary from years of squinting at Latin verbs. One of them looks up, sensing your presence, and smiles faintly as if to say, history isn't made by kings, it's preserved by those who can't sleep. It's a strange comfort. You realize the most wanted people weren't always criminals or rulers. They were dreamers, challengers, and sometimes unlucky souls who happened to believe something new at the wrong time. Their portraits might hang crookedly in dusty castles or be buried in footnotes, but their echoes fill every stone corridor you pass. A rat scurries by, startled by your footsteps. Somewhere, a church bell tolls midnight. You follow the sound toward the square, where gossip and fear blend with laughter. An old storyteller, half drunk and half saint, sits by a brazier, spinning tales of heroes and traitors, until even he can't remember which were which. He looks up, squints through the smoke, and nods at you like an accomplice. History, he says softly, is just wanted posters written by whoever lived long enough to tell the story. You smile. The night stretches out ahead, heavy with secrets, and the torchlight flickers like a heartbeat. Every step forward feels like opening another dusty page, the parchment crackling under invisible hands. You lean into the rhythm of your breath, listening to distant hoofbeats fade into silence, and know the chase through medieval memory has only just begun. You wake still inside the dream of that cobbled city, but now the air smells faintly of crushed lavender and ash. The morning after a coronation, or maybe the aftermath of a siege. Either way, you can tell the kings didn't sleep well. Power looks impressive in tapestries, but up close, it's mostly ulcers, paranoia, and bad wine. You wander through the corridors of a royal palace, where every whisper sounds like a conspiracy. The floor is slick with wax stone, polished by servants who move silently enough to overhear everything. A tapestry shows a lion devouring a stag, an unsubtle reminder of royal priorities. Somewhere, a chamberlain yawns, trying to remember whether he bowed correctly to the right duke last night. The first sleepless monarch you pass is King John of England, the guy who somehow managed to make everyone hate him. Taxes, wars, church feuds, and that one time he tried to seize church property because he wanted better curtains. It all caught up to him. By 1215, his barons had had enough and cornered him into signing the Magna Carta, the medieval version of, "We're going to need a written contract this time." The mainstream fact. That document limited the king's power and planted the seeds for constitutional government centuries later. But the quirky part. John probably couldn't read it very well. His Latin was shaky, and the ink might have barely dried before he started scheming to ignore it anyway. You can almost picture him rolling it up, sighing, and muttering. Well, that was awkward. Before planning his next round of betrayals, historians still argue whether John was truly evil or just spectacularly unlucky. A man trying to hold together a crumbling empire with duct tape and bad temper. Either way, you wouldn't want to share a dinner table with him. The soup was probably poisoned, and so were the conversations. Further along, you find another restless king, Richard the Lionheart. Charismatic, reckless, forever chasing wars instead of sleep. He spent only a few months actually ruling England, and most of his reign gallivanting across Europe on crusades. His people loved the idea of him more than his leadership. He was like a celebrity monarch, whose fan club kept paying taxes while he was off filming action scenes. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Richard once sold the official royal title to Scotland for cash, basically a medieval on-subscribe fee to fund his crusade. You can almost hear his accountants whispering, "Majesty, maybe stop selling bits of your kingdom like old furniture." But he didn't listen. And somewhere along a dusty road near Limousin, a crossbow bolt found him. It said he forgave the boy who shot him before dying, though historians still debate whether that was noble truth or a carefully scripted legend. You pass from the sound of clinking armor to the steady scratching of a quill. The next sleepless ruler sits at a candlelit desk. Edward I. Longshanks, the tall and tireless planner. He's the type who'd make a color-coded spreadsheet if parchment allowed it. Known for conquering Wales and hammering Scotland, he's remembered as both lawgiver and tyrant, depending on which border you stand behind. Mainstream fact. He ordered the building of massive castles like Caernarfon and Conwy, each one a statement of dominance as much as defense. The quirky part. He also issued an official decree banning unnecessary luxury among his subjects. Apparently, peasants were dressing too fancy for his taste. Imagine writing legislation because you thought the commoners' sleeves were getting uppity. Historians still argue whether his campaigns were calculated genius or compulsive control freakery, disguised as destiny. You take a turn down a hallway hung with portraits, but the eyes that follow you aren't all male. Here comes Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, then England, and quite possibly the most formidable insomniac of the 12th century. She navigated marriages, rebellions, and imprisonment, all while wearing veils heavy enough to double as parachutes. You stand by her side in a smoky court in Poitiers, where troubadours sing and knights fidget like teenagers at open mic night. Eleanor's sharp eyes scan the crowd. She knows half of them are plotting something, and the other half are bad at pretending they aren't. A mainstream fact glimmers. She joined the Second Crusade, traveling thousands of miles across hostile lands with her ladies, in waiting, dressed in armor, refusing to play the passive queen. The quirky part. Some chroniclers accused her of scandalously riding astride like a man, which, for medieval gossips, was apparently the equivalent of a celebrity wardrobe malfunction. Historians still argue whether Eleanor's reputation for manipulation was real or just the chronicler's discomfort with a woman who refused to sit quietly. You can almost hear her muttering, "If you want something done, send a queen with good riding boots." You exit her chamber and step into another royal night, this time the chill of the north. King Robert the Bruce of Scotland crouches near a flickering fire, his crown somewhere between defiance and exhaustion. Legend says he once watched a spider try and fail to spin a web across a beam, only to succeed after 6 tries. If at first you don't succeed, the moral goes, don't invade England just yet. Whether that story ever happened, historians still argue, but it stuck. The mainstream fact, he defeated the English at Bannockburn in 1314, securing Scotland's independence for a time. The quirky footnote, his heart was literally taken on crusade after his death, carried by a knight in a small casket. You stare at the flames and imagine that heart beating faintly against a stranger's chest, still longing for holy war. From the highlands you drift south again, to France. Always France, forever at war with someone, often itself. The Valois kings, the Bourbons before their time, the endless cousinly feuds. You find Charles VI in his royal chamber, staring at the mirror with panic in his eyes. He believes his body is made of glass. Servants must tiptoe around him, lest he shatter. This isn't metaphorical, he genuinely believed it. A mainstream fact, his reign, from 1380 to 1422, saw France nearly collapse from civil war and English invasion. A quirky detail. He wore reinforced clothing, padded with iron rods to prevent cracking. Historians still debate whether his illness was schizophrenia, trauma, or the side effect of too many mercury-based medicines. You feel a strange sympathy. Being king doesn't shield you from being human. It only magnifies the madness. As dawn breaks outside, you cross into the German principalities, where emperors juggle politics like hot coals. You overhear the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Kiwe, called Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world, debating theology with scholars in multiple languages. He's excommunicated more than once, mostly because the Pope can't decide whether to fear him or hire him. The mainstream fact. Frederick founded the University of Naples, one of Europe's earliest state universities. The quirky twist. He supposedly kept a personal zoo filled with exotic animals, including a camel and a talking parrot that greeted visitors in Latin. Historians still argue whether his obsession with knowledge made him enlightened or dangerously heretical. You imagine him late at night, talking to that parrot, half joking, half confessing. Maybe you're the only one who listens. Your path winds back west, where Louis Ix, later St. Louis, sits in quiet contemplation beneath a chapel window. He's praying for his soldiers, his people, maybe his own soul. He's the model of pious kingship, though perhaps a little too devout for comfort. The mainstream fact, he led 2 crusades, both disastrous, dying of dysentery under the North African sun. The quirky note, he collected relics obsessively, even purchasing the supposed crown of thorns for an astronomical sum. You can almost hear his treasurer whisper, "Majesty, maybe buy some clean water instead." Historians still argue whether his sainthood was earned by purity or propaganda. As the candles burn lower, the kings fade into a shared insomnia. They were wanted, sometimes adored, sometimes hunted, for the same reason they couldn't stop wanting more. More land, more legacy, more certainty that history would remember them kindly. But power doesn't make good bedtime company. You glance through a narrow window slit at the horizon. The first grey blush of dawn spreads across the rooftops. A rooster crows somewhere, oblivious to royal despair. And you realize something quietly universal: every crown is just a fancy form of insomnia. You can't sleep when you're terrified of losing what you've built. You move through the silent throne room, stepping carefully between banners and shadows. A jester's hat lies abandoned on the floor, one bell still faintly chiming as you pass. Maybe it's laughter, or maybe it's the echo of history reminding you that every ruler's story is just a chapter before someone else's revolt. Outside, the air smells of dew and ash. The wanted faces fade one by one into the morning mist. John, Richard, Eleanor, Robert, Charles, Frederick, Louis, all of them reduced to names, coins, and bedtime tales. You exhale, letting the centuries drift back into silence. The torches gutter out, and somewhere deep within the palace walls, a scribe closes his ledger. Whispering that same old line, you're starting to believe power never sleeps, but it dreams restlessly. You find yourself walking through a corridor that smells faintly of jasmine and politics. The air is perfumed, but heavy, like the moment before someone says something they can't take back. The torches burn lower here, casting soft light across walls, lined with portraits of women who seem to be half smiling, half plotting. The kings have retreated to their sleepless beds. Now it's the queens who stay awake, their minds sharper than the daggers hidden in their sleeves. You drift closer, the floor whispering underfoot. Somewhere nearby, a court musician strums a lute, sweet notes tangled with the faint sound of intrigue. You don't need to understand the words to know that every lyric hides a rumor. First, there's Eleanor of Aquitaine again. Though older now, her beauty softened into the kind of calm that makes everyone else nervous. She's sitting by the fire, mending a letter with a needle instead of a quill. The letter isn't hers to fix. It's her son's, Richard's. But you can tell she's rewriting his future one careful stitch at a time. She knows how to fight wars without picking up a sword. A mainstream fact drifts by: Eleanor spent years imprisoned by her husband, Henry Sue, for supporting her son's rebellion. Yet she emerged unbroken, and when Henry died, she became regent, running England while Richard went crusading. The quirky part: even during captivity, she managed to smuggle coded letters through her ladies-in-waiting's laundry baskets. Medieval espionage, brought to you by creative fabric folding. Historians still argue whether she was a power-hungry manipulator or the first feminist icon of the age. But you can almost hear her voice, soft, sardonic, saying, "Men call it ambition when they do it, rebellion when I do." The firelight fades, and you step into another chamber. The scent changes. Now it's rosewater and silk, a sign you've entered the domain of Isabella of France, the Wolf of England. The nickname alone feels like gossip written in blood. She's pacing near the window, the hem of her gown dragging across the tiles like the tail of a storm. Her husband, Edward Sir, prefers the company of his male favourites. She prefers vengeance. A mainstream fact: Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, led a rebellion in 1326, overthrowing Edward Tyre and effectively ruling in the name of her young son. The quirky note legend says she and Mortimer used a secret code of jeweled pins in letters, each colour and placement signifying a different instruction. Historians still debate whether Edward truly died by a red, hot poker, or if that gruesome story was later propagandas, and probably written by someone who needed better hobbies. You glance at Isabella's reflection in the window. It shimmers like moonlight on water, unraidable. For a moment, you wonder if she feels the weight of her crown, or if she simply enjoys the quiet power of not being underestimated anymore. The corridor lengthens, and you follow the echo of laughter. Low, musical, dangerous. It leads you to the court of Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother of France, surrounded by alchemists, astrologers, and silk-clad courtiers pretending not to tremble. You pass a shelf lined with glass jars containing who knows what herbs, poisons, perfumes. All three smell suspiciously similar. A mainstream fact: Catherine de' Medici was queen consort, then regent, ruling through three of her sons during the bloody French wars of religion. The quirky detail: she was said to have introduced fork etiquette to France. Before her, people ate mostly with knives and fingers. Imagine trying to bring table manners to people who were already plotting to stab you during dessert. Historians still argue whether she orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre or merely failed to stop it. Either way, her legacy lingers like a perfume you can't wash off. You drift closer to her, noticing a small vial on her table labeled Aqua Tofana. The rumor says it's poison disguised as face lotion, a beauty treatment with lethal side effects. She meets your eyes through the candlelight, smiles faintly, and whispers, "Every woman in power needs options." You decide not to ask what she means. From France, you wander to the chill of Scandinavia, where another queen waits. Margaret I of Denmark, the quiet architect of the Kalmar Union. The world remembers kings for battles, but Margaret's weapon was patience. She united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her rule through diplomacy sharper than any sword. A mainstream fact: in 1397, she founded the Kalmar Union, effectively creating a single crown over three kingdoms. The quirky side: she insisted on being called not queen, but sovereign lady and lord, claiming both titles because one gender wasn't enough for the job. Historians still debate whether she ruled from conviction or cold calculation. Either way, you can feel the steadiness in her gaze. A ruler who could win wars simply by refusing to raise her voice. The sound of church bells fades as you walk through another threshold, this one glowing with golden mosaics. The Byzantine court again. Empress Irene of Athens sits upon the throne of Constantinople, alone. Once the mother of an emperor, now the emperor herself. She ruled in her own right after blinding her rebellious son. Whether that horror truly happened, or was a political smear, historians still argue. A mainstream fact: Irene called the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, restoring the veneration of icons after decades of iconoclasm. The quirky twist: to secure her rule, she had coins minted with her face, unveiled, no male counterpart beside her, a shocking act in that world. She stares out from one of those coins now, eyes calm, expression unreadable. You wonder if she ever slept well after that decision. The torches flicker as you step through time again. The air warms, the scent of orange blossoms replaces incense. This is Spain, and the woman before you wears armor beneath her gown. Isabella of Castile, half of the duo that unified Spain and funded Columbus's westward gamble. A mainstream fact: her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 united Spain under one crown, marking the dawn of empire. The quirky part: she personally supervised military campaigns while pregnant, a detail the chroniclers alternately admired and fretted over. Historians still debate whether her zeal for religious unity was faith or fanaticism. You glance around the dim hall, lined with maps and crucifixes, and think it's probably both. Through another doorway, you glimpse Anne Boleyn, twirling an emerald ring around her finger, a nervous habit turned prophecy. You already know how her story ends. Henry Vere's temper, a scaffold, a sharp blade. But in this quiet moment, she's laughing. She doesn't yet know she's a future ghost in a crown of pearls. The mainstream fact: Anne was executed in 1536 after being accused of adultery and witchcraft. The quirky tidbit: she had 6 fingers on one hand, according to some reports, though historians still argue whether that was true or Tudor. Era gossip meant to paint her as monstrous. You see her brush her hair aside, revealing perfectly normal hands. The myth lingers though, another unwanted legacy. Beyond her shadow, a quieter queen waits. Elizabeth Woodville, wife of Edward IV, mother of the princes in the Tower. Her beauty was legendary, her enemies numerous. You can almost hear her voice echoing down the stone halls. Every smile costs a secret. A mainstream fact. She was the first commoner to marry a reigning English king. The quirky one, she was rumoured to practice witchcraft, though the evidence was that her hair stayed perfect in humidity. Historians still argue whether she truly meddled in magic, or merely knew how to hold her own in a room full of schemers. The room shifts again, and suddenly you're in Russia. Moscow under the eerie silence of winter. Catherine the Great reclines beside a window, watching snow drift across the palace courtyard. She isn't technically medieval, but the echoes still fit. She reads by lamplight, surrounded by imported French books, and a globe that shows lands she'll never see. A mainstream fact, she modernized Russia, expanded its borders, and corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers. A quirky detail, she kept an elaborate collection of portraits of her lovers, commissioned in miniature and hidden behind her writing desk. Historians still debate whether her love life overshadowed her politics, but as you watch her yawn delicately and turn another page, it's clear she found her own kind of peace in both. You take a breath, realizing these women were never just queens. They were survivors, tacticians, performers. Some ruled through fear, others through charm, all through an understanding of how fragile a throne really is. You trace your fingers along a carved wooden door, worn smooth by centuries of hands. Behind it, you can still hear faint murmurs, laughter, plotting prayer. Queens with daggers in their smiles, their faces painted into the margins of history, half adored, half feared. As the torches burn low, the corridor darkens, but you can still feel their presence. Eleanor's wit, Isabella's fury, Catherine's cunning, Margaret's patience. They linger like perfume long after the wearer has gone. You walk toward the end of the hall, where moonlight spills through a lattice window, and whisper their names softly to yourself, a quiet roll call of brilliance and danger. Outside, an owl calls. The night deepens, and history exhales again, soft, scented, and still very much awake. The castle air cools as the perfume of queens fades into something drier, dust and iron, and the smell of old leather. You're standing at the edge of a camp that never really sleeps, even when its banners droop with exhaustion. The dawn here is red with rusted armor and distant prayers. You walk past rows of tents, each one breathing softly like lungs, holding knights who dream of glory, guilt, or just warm bread. The crusaders' dream, you realize, is not about peace. It's about chasing the idea of holiness through heat, hunger, and dust. You tug your cloak tighter, feeling sand crunch between your teeth. The camp stirs around you, armor being buckled, horses stamping. A priest mumbling blessings, he's not sure still work this far from home. You wander between knights who look both magnificent and miserable. Men who haven't bathed in weeks, polishing swords they can barely lift. The sun is barely up, and already the air hums with flies. A mainstream fact arrives like a trumpet. The First Crusade began in 1096, called by Pope Urban II to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Thousands answered the call, some out of faith, some for land, and some because, well, it sounded like an adventure. The quirky part. Many of them sold their houses, armor, even pets to afford the trip. One chronicler mentions a man who actually pawned his wife's jewelry and forgot to tell her why. Historians still argue whether the Crusades were religious missions or opportunistic land grabs, dressed up in theology. You step past a knight praying on his knees, sword buried point, first in the ground. He's muttering Latin words that sound like apologies. You wonder who he's asking forgiveness from: God, his victims, or his own stomach for another dinner of dried fish and dust. Farther down, you glimpse the shimmering banners of the Knights Templar, white cloth marked with a red cross, fluttering like ghostly sails. They move with discipline, armor gleaming, expressions unreadable. To some, they're holy warriors; to others, the most dangerous bankers in Europe. A mainstream fact: the Templars became astonishingly rich, creating one of the first international financial networks. Pilgrims could deposit money in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem. The quirky twist: they also had a secret handshake, described by one bewildered chronicler as overly complicated but impressive. Historians still argue whether the order truly worshipped strange idols, or if those charges were cooked up by Philip IV of France when he wanted their fortune. You walk among their tents, hearing muttered prayers and the faint jingle of chainmail. One knight looks up from cleaning his sword and grins faintly. "You'd think holiness smelled better," he says. You laugh softly, not wanting to wake the others. The desert wind shifts, carrying voices from another camp. You follow, finding yourself amid the banners of Saladin's army. The crescent moon glints on curved blades, and the scent of mint tea cuts through the dust. Here the air hums differently, not with guilt, but with wary patience. Saladin himself, calm amid chaos, sits cross-legged before a small brazier. He's not the villain Western tales painted him as. He's courteous, intelligent, even admired by his enemies. A mainstream fact: after recapturing Jerusalem in 1187, he allowed Christian civilians to leave peacefully, a mercy unheard of for the time. The quirky note: he reportedly kept a personal physician who treated both Muslim and Christian soldiers, depending on who needed him first. Historians still debate whether Saladin's chivalry was sincere compassion or strategic brilliance. But as you watch him share tea with a wary messenger, it seems both can coexist. Night falls again, and the campfire glow flickers across 1,000 tired faces. The crusaders write letters home, ink blots in the sand, confessions to wives they might never see again. You sit beside one scribe, whose hands shake from heat and exhaustion. He murmurs about Jerusalem like it's a mirage. "We think we're saving it," he says. "But maybe it's saving us from boredom." You can't tell if he's joking, but his eyes say he's half serious. The laughter that follows is small, cracked, the sound of someone who's forgotten what safety feels like. When the wind picks up, you follow it westward to the Mediterranean, ships rocking in harbors filled with both knights and cats, the unofficial mascots of every medieval port. You smell tar, salt, and oranges. Traders haggle beside clerics, languages blend into one long sigh of commerce and crusade. Here, in the docks of Venice, a deal is being struck that will change everything. The Fourth Crusade, meant for the Holy Land, will instead end up sacking Constantinople in 1204. The mainstream fact: the Venetians redirected the Crusaders to pay off debts by conquering Christian cities. The quirky detail: one chronicler claims they justified it by saying, "God loves efficiency." Historians still argue whether greed or genuine misunderstanding caused that detour, but the flames that consumed Constantinople didn't care either way. You walk through those burning streets in memory, gold mosaics cracking, icons melting, soldiers tripping over treasure they can't carry. One man stuffs relics into his pockets like souvenirs. Somewhere, a monk weeps, clutching a fragment of scripture. You feel the heat on your face and the slow, endless guilt of history replaying itself. By the time the smoke clears, the Crusader dream has soared into politics. You find yourself back in Europe, where kings and popes still wave crosses like brands. But fewer people listen. The later crusades become smaller, stranger, against heretics, pagans, even fellow Christians. A mainstream fact: the Children's Crusade of 1212 saw thousands of young people march toward the sea, believing God would part the waves. None reached Jerusalem. The quirky part. Some accounts say the leaders were teenage shepherds who claimed to have visions while tending sheep. Historians still argue whether the crusade truly happened or became a tragic myth repeated to scare parents. You feel a chill as you imagine the sound of tiny footsteps fading into waves. The dream shifts again. You're now walking through a dusty hall filled with relics, splinters of the true cross, saintly bones, jars labelled in Latin. Pilgrims shuffle by, eyes half closed, hoping a touch of wood or bone might forgive a lifetime of sin. Some weep, some count coins, some just nap. Here's your quirky moment. One supposed relic, the holy foreskin, had multiple competing claimants across Europe. Monks actually debated whose version was genuine. You pause, suppressing a laugh. You can't decide whether to admire the faith or the marketing. Historians still argue whether any of them were real, but honestly, you hope no one ever tested them. The hall darkens, and a cool breeze wraps around you. You've reached the late Crusader period, when Europe's zeal is fading, and the East has begun to forget these foreign invaders. You walk among the ruins of once mighty fortresses, now playgrounds for owls and sand. The Templars' castles stand empty, their stone walls scarred with graffiti in a dozen forgotten tongues. You stop beside a carved cross half buried in dust. Someone has scratched a note beneath it in clumsy French. "Tell my wife I died clean." You close your eyes, hearing waves crash far away. Clean or not, they all died wanting the same thing: to matter in a story that had already begun forgetting them. When you open your eyes, the desert has melted into a candle-lit tavern. Crusaders who survived now sit beside merchants and monks, telling stories so exaggerated they sound like dreams. One man swears he saw angels on the battlefield. Another insists he traded a relic for a chicken. You sip the ale they offer. It tastes like salt, sweat, and a hint of redemption. Someone asks whether it was worth it. The laughter that follows is long and tired. Of course, one knight says with a wink, "If we hadn't gone, who else would have brought back lemons?" You chuckle quietly. The kind of laughter that doesn't dismiss the pain, just softens it. Even the dead deserve a punchline. As the fire dies, you watch the smoke curl toward the rafters, carrying with it centuries of faith, greed, and hope tangled beyond recognition. Outside, the wind sighs across the stones where banners once flew. The Crusaders' restless dream finally drifts towards sleep, not ending, just dissolving into the dust it created. You step away from the tavern, into the cool night, hearing only the soft jingle of an abandoned sword swaying in the breeze. It's peaceful, almost. You realize that holiness, like history, is something everyone wants to own, but no one really understands. And as you walk back into the quiet, stars flickering above the desert horizon, you murmur to yourself, half prayer, half joke, "Next time, maybe we just send postcards." You wake to the sound of quills scratching, 100 tiny claws on parchment. The war camps have faded, replaced by candlelit chambers that smell of ink, beeswax, and the faint tang of singed curiosity. You're in a university now, or something that wants to be one. The ceiling leaks, the benches wobble, and the air is thick with questions that could get someone burned. The scholars are arguing, naturally. One insists angels can move faster than light. Another says that's impossible, because he hasn't yet measured light. But he's working on it. You pass among them like a ghost, brushing shoulders with thinkers who live dangerously close to heresy. Their robes are threadbare, their fingers stained black, and their minds aflame. A mainstream fact drifts in like a whispered lecture, the first European universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries. They were supposed to teach theology, law, and medicine, but what they really taught was how to argue politely for 10 hours straight. A quirky detail: Degrees took so long to earn that some students died of old age before graduation. Historians still argue whether that was because of academic rigor or medieval cafeteria food. You lean against a pillar while one grey, bearded master declaims Aristotle's view of the cosmos. The earth sits still at the center, he says, wrapped in crystalline spheres. You can almost hear a young student at the back mumble, "Are we sure about that?" His name, of course, is Copernicus, and his question will spin the world itself off its hinges. He hasn't yet published anything. He's still just dreaming. But you watch him glance out the window, eyes on the stars, already suspecting they're not revolving around him. He'll keep quiet for decades. Smart man. But eventually his little Latin book will land like a thunderclap. Historians still argue whether he believed it was true or merely mathematical convenience. But you can tell from his steady hand that doubt has become destiny. You move on through corridors where ideas buzz like flies. At one table, Thomas Aquinas is dictating at full speed, his scribes frantically dipping quills. He's trying to reconcile Aristotle with Christianity, reason and faith, oil and water. The mainstream fact. His Summa Theologica attempted to explain all knowledge under God, and for a while, everyone nodded wisely as if it worked. The quirky tidbit. Aquinas was so prolific that his nickname was the Ox, not for his size, but for his unstoppable endurance. You picture him now, calmly dropping philosophical boulders into conversation. "Discuss among yourselves," he might say, and half the room would faint. Historians still debate whether he was a genius or simply the world's most determined note-taker. Further down the hall, you hear a different tone. Whispers, not lectures, heretics talking too softly. One woman sits by a small fire, copying a psalm in her native tongue. Her name might be Marguerite Perrate, author of The Mirror of Simple Souls, who claimed a soul could commune directly with God, without the church's help. You can almost feel the tremor in her hand. The words glow with love and danger. A mainstream fact, she was burned in Paris in 1310 for refusing to recant her book. The quirky part for years afterward. Her writings circulated anonymously, cherished by nuns who pretended not to know the author. Historians still argue whether she was mystic, poet, or stubborn revolutionary. You just see her smile faintly as the firelight flickers and realize courage sometimes sounds like whispering. The air sharpens with the scent of ink again. But now you're outside England's grey stone walls, where John Wycliffe's followers, the Lollards, translate the Bible into English. They work in secret, quills trembling, aware that discovery means the stake. A mainstream fact by the 1380s, Wycliffe's translation made scripture accessible to common people for the first time. The quirky note, some copies were hidden inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. Historians still debate whether Wycliffe's motives were purely spiritual or delightfully rebellious. You imagine one baker passing a steaming Bible loaf across the counter and winking. Somewhere nearby, a printing press coughs to life. New, miraculous, slightly terrifying. Metal letters click, ink spreads, and ideas start reproducing faster than the church can censor. Gutenberg's invention around 1450 changes everything. You pick up a fresh page, the ink smears on your thumb, and suddenly knowledge feels solid, mass-produced, unstoppable. You wander into a cramped room filled with freshly printed pamphlets, philosophers, astrologers, and conspiracy theorists all arguing across columns. A mainstream fact. Early printers reused paper so frugally that sometimes you could see old accounts for wine or cheese faintly underneath the new text. The quirky detail. One printer in Venice reportedly lost a lawsuit for printing astrology charts that predicted bad harvests. Economic sabotage, the court said. Historians still argue whether the lawsuit was for heresy or bad business sense. You duck out as the smell of melted lead gives way to incense. A friar passes, glaring. Not everyone appreciates progress. You follow him to a lecture hall where an inquisitor addresses students about dangerous novelty. His voice is smooth, reasonable, and entirely chilling. "We are not against learning," he insists. "Only uncontrolled learning." You slip quietly to the back, where a woman in rough wool listens with an ironic smile. You recognize her, Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary abbess who composed music, studied medicine, and claimed divine inspiration. She's older now, serene and slightly exasperated by men who think they invented thinking. A mainstream fact: Hildegard wrote one of the earliest known descriptions of the female orgasm, politely hidden in a treatise on reproduction. The quirky part: she also prescribed crushed gemstones for curing melancholy. Historians still argue whether she truly believed in her visions or used them as safe camouflage for genius. You can't decide which is cleverer. The scene changes. You're in Florence now, where universities give way to workshops. Scholars trade their robes for aprons, and learning smells of oil paint and copper dust. A young man named Leonardo sketches winged machines beside anatomical drawings. He hums to himself, equal parts monk and mad scientist. A mainstream fact: he filled thousands of notebook pages with designs centuries ahead of his time. The quirky twist: he often wrote in mirror script, partly for secrecy, partly because it amused him. Historians still argue whether he feared censorship or simply enjoyed confusing future readers. As you watch him mix pigment with egg yolk, he glances up. "We all serve the same master," he says softly. "Curiosity?" Then he grins. "Also deadlines?" You smile, even genius has paperwork. The laughter fades into the hum of another scholar's nightmare, the trial of Galileo Galilei. He's older now, muttering to himself, tired of pretending the earth stands still. The courtroom smells of dust and sweat. Clerics frown. He kneels, recants, and as legend insists, whispers, "And yet it moves." A mainstream fact: that phrase never appeared in the official records. The quirky note centuries later: someone found it scribbled under a portrait of Galileo, maybe by a fan. Historians still argue whether he actually said it, or if humanity simply needed him to have said it. Either way, the whisper still turns in your ear as you leave the hall. You cross a courtyard scattered with fallen leaves. Students sit on stone benches, debating everything from divine grace to proper table manners. You pause near a group testing the latest invention: eyeglasses. The lenses gleam in the morning sun. A mainstream fact: the first spectacles appeared in Italy in the late 1200s, probably made by monks tired of miscopying psalms. The quirky side: they were originally sold door to door by traveling peddlers who promised instant holiness through clearer reading. Historians still argue who invented them, but you're just grateful someone did. The sound of debate grows distant. You follow it to a quiet garden, where a single student lies awake under the stars, staring upward. His name isn't famous yet. It might never be. He's just another restless mind, wondering why the heavens don't quite behave as the textbooks claim. You realize that history's wanted list isn't filled only with warriors and monarchs. It's full of people like him, dangerous because they dare to ask, why? A firefly drifts past your face. The night softens. Somewhere, a bell rings for evening prayers. The scholars pack up their manuscripts, arguing all the way to the dormitory. You linger, breathing the mixed scent of parchment and autumn. You think of all the questions that survived despite fear. The ones hidden in bread, whispered in dorm rooms, printed in shaky ink. You realize knowledge doesn't march forward, it sneaks. It hides in metaphors, disguises itself as devotion, and waits for a safer century. A soft wind flips open a forgotten page beside you. On it, a single sentence glows in the lamplight. Truth is a pilgrim too. You smile at the thought, because maybe that's all this age ever was. Pilgrims of the mind wandering through forbidden fields, hoping the stars would forgive them. As the candles burn low, you close the book gently. The debate continues somewhere far away, but here, in this quiet garden of thought and smoke, every voice finally hushes. The ink dries, the quills rest, and even the most curious mind lets itself drift towards sleep, still half dreaming of how much more there is to learn. Her word count to 22 he. The pages of learning close like heavy eyelids, and when they open again, you find yourself standing in a forest that feels entirely alive. Moss climbs the trunks in velvet coats, and the trees whisper as if they're gossiping about kings. You walk down a dirt path worn by centuries of boots and hooves, the air thick with wood smoke and wet leaves. Somewhere ahead, bells toll faintly, not from churches but from wagons. You follow the sound, and there they are, the wanderers, the merchants, the minstrels, the outlaws, the people who move between stories. Their fires glimmer at the forest's edge. One man is strumming a lute that's missing a string, but not its charm. Another woman balances a pot over the flames and hums a tune in a language that might not exist anymore. You sit beside them, and they welcome you like someone who's finally remembered their own curiosity. The Middle Ages loved walls. Castle walls, monastery walls, city walls. But these travelers slip through the cracks. They're the world's rumor carriers. You hear them trade stories about kings who disguise themselves as beggars, about saints who argue with crows, about a cat who was once a pope. Probably an exaggeration, but it's late, and no one's correcting them. A mainstream fact in medieval Europe, minstrels, troubadours, and jongleurs were the original influencers, carrying news, songs, and satire from one village to another. A quirky tidbit. Some troubadours claim to have invented romantic love itself, because someone had to take credit for it. Historians still argue whether these songs reflected real passion, or were just elaborate PR campaigns for bored nobles. You watch one troubadour adjust his feathered hat, strumming a melancholic tune about a lady who sends her knight on a quest to find a rose that sings. You're not sure what that symbolizes, but you can tell by the collective sigh that it works. Even in the dark, a few listeners wipe their eyes, pretending it's just the smoke. A boy near the fire begins juggling apples, badly, and nearly hits a friar, who crosses himself reflexively and then claps. Everyone laughs. The sound is so human, so immediate, it cuts through the centuries. This is history without crowns or swords. Just the heartbeat of people trying to entertain each other while the world burns somewhere else. In the flickering firelight, another figure steps forward. A woman with a basket of herbs. She smells like rain and rosemary, her hands stained green from grinding leaves. The others fall quiet as she begins to tell stories about healing foxglove for the heart, willow bark for fever, honey for wounds. A mainstream fact. Medieval medicine was a curious blend of Greek theory, folk wisdom, and divine hope. The quirky part. One popular cure for baldness was a mixture of pigeon droppings and vinegar. You glance at the woman's full head of hair and decide she probably skipped that recipe. Historians still argue whether wise women like her were healers, midwives, or just early scientists in disguise. She pulls a small jar from her basket and hands it to you. The label, in shaky ink, reads, "To keep nightmares away." Inside is lavender and salt. You thank her quietly, unsure whether it's superstition or kindness. But then again, what's the difference at bedtime? The crowd thins as dawn brushes the treetops, but one figure lingers. A tall, wary man with a weather-beaten face, and the look of someone who's been everywhere and seen too much. He introduces himself as Marco, though you suspect that's only one of many names. He begins to speak of distant deserts, jeweled cities, and emperors who dine on pearls dissolved in wine. A mainstream fact, Marco Polo's travels, written in the late 13th century, introduced Europe to the wonders of Asia. Kublai Khan's court, paper money, and noodles that suspiciously resemble Italian pasta. The quirky note: some scholars think his stories were exaggerated or borrowed from others. Historians still argue whether Marco actually reached China or just had an excellent imagination. You smile. Sometimes the best travelers never leave the tavern. As Marco's voice fades, the forest path opens into a sprawling marketplace. The noise hits like a wave. Merchants shouting in 10 languages, goats complaining, coins clinking, spices sizzling. You wander through it all, your senses overwhelmed. Cinnamon, salt, silk, and something smoky like mystery. A mainstream fact: medieval trade routes connected Europe to Africa and Asia long before the Renaissance, bringing not only goods but ideas. The quirky side: pepper was so valuable that it was stored under lock and key, and thieves caught stealing it were punished, as if they'd stolen gold. Historians still argue whether this spice trade fueled Europe's expansion, or just made everyone's stew slightly less terrible. You stop at a spice merchant's booth where tiny glass jars shimmer like treasure. "Smell this," he says, opening one filled with cardamom. The scent hits you like warmth in human form. "Worth a king's ransom," he adds, proudly exaggerating. You look around and notice that, in a sense, it's true. Half the market exists just to feed the hunger for something that tastes like elsewhere. Beyond the traders, a cluster of jesters performs for coins. One balances on a barrel while reciting jokes about the local bishop. Another juggles knives while pretending to juggle ethics. The crowd roars. A mainstream fact: jesters often enjoyed surprising immunity from punishment. They could mock nobles when others couldn't. The quirky bit: some wore caps with donkey ears not to symbolize foolishness, but as a sly reference to King Midas, whose secret everyone knew. Historians still argue whether jesters were simple entertainers or political pressure valves disguised in bells. You pause, laughing with everyone else as one jester mimics a knight, trying to flirt in full armor. Though, hast stolen my heart.
Please, help me find it under this breastplate!
You realize that humor, in every century, is the world's truest mirror. As evening falls again, the market transforms. Torches flare, shadows lengthen, and minstrels tune their instruments. A puppet show begins and children sit wide-eyed as dragons dance on strings. Behind the stage, the puppeteer smiles at you knowingly. "Every story's got a master," he whispers. "Even this one." You nod, wondering which hand pulls your own strings. You drift past a wagon painted with stars, the traveling astrologers. He beckons you closer, unfolding a chart filled with swirling constellations. "You were born under a talkative moon," he says. You can't argue with that. A mainstream fact: astrology in the Middle Ages wasn't fringe. It was mainstream science, practiced by doctors and popes alike. The quirky detail: medical students learned to time bloodletting according to planetary alignments. Historians still argue whether astrology's persistence was faith or just statistical optimism. You leave the astrologer's tent with a slip of parchment predicting great journeys and mild indigestion. Not wrong so far. As the stars rise higher, you walk with the merchants packing up their wares. One man carefully covers a bundle of manuscripts, Persian poetry translated into Latin. He lets you peek at a line. "The world is a caravanserai. We stop, we rest, we go." You realize that for all their wanderings, these people understand something most kings never do: that movement itself is the only permanence. You pass a group of pilgrims trudging down the same road, shells pinned to their cloaks, muttering prayers with blistered lips. They nod as you walk by, too tired to ask your story. Maybe they think you're one of them. Maybe you are. A mainstream fact: the Camino de Santiago was one of the era's most famous pilgrimage routes, drawing thousands across Europe. The quirky bit: one 14th century pilgrim claimed his donkey had a spiritual awakening en route. Historians still argue whether that was divine intervention or dehydration. The path winds on until the forest thins, and you find yourself looking back at the flickering lights of the wagons. The music fades, replaced by the quiet murmur of night insects. You sit on a fallen log, letting the smell of smoke cling to your clothes. You think of the songs, the herbs, the spices, the laughter, the undercurrent of life that keeps flowing beneath the grand pageantry of empires and crusades. These are the people who filled the margins of chronicles, unnamed but unforgettable. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hoots like a punchline to a story you'll never fully understand. You smile, pulling the nightmare jar from your pocket, and open it just enough to let the lavender breathe. It works instantly. The forest exhales, the stars blink slower, and your thoughts begin to loosen like knots in soft rain. The road, the campfires, the wandering voices, all fade into the same gentle hum of history's heartbeat. You lean back against the moss and close your eyes. For the first time in this long, winding journey through the medieval night, you don't feel like an observer. You feel like a passenger. Just another traveler, stopping for a while before the next story calls. The soft rhythm of wagon wheels fades, and when you open your eyes again, the forest has thinned into rolling fields striped with mist. The morning air smells faintly of dew and hay, a cleaner, quieter world than the markets and marches you've left behind. You're standing at the edge of a village, the kind that never makes it into history books unless something burns. But tonight, this is where the heart of the Middle Ages beats the strongest, in the dirt underfoot, the bread on the table, and the gossip between neighbours who've all known each other since birth. You walk down a rutted lane between wattle and daub cottages. Smoke curls from every thatched roof, lazy and blue. A rooster crows like it's auditioning for drama school. The entire village stretches and yawns into its daily ritual. A mainstream fact: more than 90% of people in medieval Europe lived in rural communities like this. Peasants, farmers, craftsmen, and their families. The quirky part: peasant wasn't an insult back then. It simply meant person of the land. Historians still argue whether these villagers lived joyless, oppressed lives, or simply different rhythms of contentment. You pass a baker pulling loaves from a clay oven. The air smells heavenly, but the bread is hard enough to chip a tooth. You take a cautious bite anyway. It's better than it looks. Slightly smoky, slightly earthy. The flavor of survival. The baker grins and says, "Yesterday's was better." They always say that. Behind the bakery, children chase a hoop down the path, shrieking like banshees. Their laughter carries over the fields, and for a moment you forget plague, crusade, or politics ever existed. You wave, and one little girl waves back, offering a flower that looks suspiciously like a weed. A woman nearby is spinning wool, the spindle twirling like a lazy comet. She hums softly, her hands sure and graceful. Spinning keeps the world from falling apart, she tells you, and you believe her. A mainstream fact: spinning and weaving were vital domestic crafts, often women's main source of income. The quirky side: some medieval spinners believed singing kept thread from tangling, a superstition that turned into a tradition. Historians still argue whether that belief was practical psychology or early economic science. The fields beyond are already alive with motion. Farmers guide ploughs behind patient oxen, their breath steaming in the chill air. You trail behind, boots sinking into the soft earth. One man nods in greeting, leaning on his hoe. "Good soil this year," he says, though his tone suggests the opposite. Farmers everywhere, you think, are experts in cautious optimism. A mainstream fact: medieval agriculture ran on a 3-field rotation. One for grain, one for legumes, one left fallow, to rest the soil. It was ingenious for its time, a quiet revolution in productivity. The quirky bit: some villages held plough blessing, festivals where priests sprinkled holy water on the fields and sometimes on the oxen, who probably didn't appreciate the gesture. Historians still argue whether these rituals were pure religion or disguised community therapy. By midday, the bells from the small stone church call everyone to pause. The priest's voice rises and falls in Latin, half of it lost to the breeze, half of it mispronounced. Yet people bow their heads anyway. Faith here isn't about comprehension, it's about rhythm, like sunrise and harvest. After the prayers, the priest greets you with tired kindness. He confides that he also serves as teacher, doctor, and occasionally referee for livestock disputes. The Lord gives many tasks. He sighs, but only 2 hands. You glance down, his fingers are ink, stained and soil, cracked, proof that sanctity and dirt can coexist. Behind the church, a small graveyard stretches toward the hedgerows. The stones tilt at odd angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by weather. A woman tends a grave, laying down marigolds. He liked the color, she says simply. You nod, realizing that remembrance is its own quiet theology. A breeze brings the scent of stew, leeks, barley, maybe a hint of salted pork. Your stomach growls, reminding you that holiness is overrated compared to lunch. You follow your nose to the village green, where a pot hangs over the fire. A dozen villagers gather around, sharing ladles and jokes. Someone passes you a wooden bowl. The stew is thin but comforting, and every mouthful tastes faintly of gratitude. The conversation drifts easily weather, animals. The rumor that the Lord's tax collector broke his leg. Everyone's trying not to look too delighted. A boy tells you about a traveling peddler who sold him a magic comb that whistles when the wind blows. You suspect it's just cracked wood, but you play along. That's some powerful enchantment, you say, and the boy beams. A mainstream fact. Rural superstition filled the spaces where formal religion didn't reach. Charms for luck, whispered blessings for crops, talismans against bad dreams. The quirky bit, some households hung dried weasel tails above the door to ward off lightning. Historians still argue whether such customs came from pagan roots or sheer creative boredom. The sun dips, turning everything gold. A man begins tuning a fiddle, and soon the green fills with music. Couples dance barefoot in the dust, skirts swirling like spilled honey. You clap along, though your rhythm is questionable. Laughter rolls across the evening air. Soft, alive, real. You notice an elderly man sitting apart from the crowd, sharpening a scythe. His hands move slowly, deliberately, preparing for harvest. You ask. He nods, then adds, and for winter. Always both. You think about that as the first stars appear. Every joy here carries its echo of survival. The dance winds down. Someone brings out ale, warm, cloudy, and potent. You sip, feeling its pleasant fuzziness crawl through your limbs. The villagers raise their mugs to the night sky, to the moon, to nothing in particular. You raise yours too, because sometimes togetherness is reason enough. Later, the air cools, and the only sounds are frogs and distant laughter. You walk toward the manor on the hill, where the village lord lives. The house isn't grand, just bigger, cleaner, guarded by geese instead of soldiers. Inside, the lord and his steward are tallying rents. They look up briefly, nod politely, then return to their parchments. A mainstream fact. Feudalism tied peasants to the land, with nobles owning most property. Yet contrary to stereotype, many lords were hands on managers rather than tyrants, balancing protection and profit. The quirky note, in some regions, peasants paid rent not in coins but in eels. Historians still argue whether that was economic pragmatism or culinary madness. Outside again, you breathe the night air, heavy with the scent of hearth smoke. The cottages flicker with firelight, distant songs drift like lullabies over the fields. For the first time, you sense the quiet dignity of this slower world, a rhythm built on patience, endurance, and the simple victory of another day's work done. You wander to the edge of a pasture where cows sleep like giant loaves of bread. Fireflies wink between the grass blades. The moon hangs low and kind. You sit on a fence post, legs swinging, thinking of how history loves to praise kings, but forgets who baked their bread. Somewhere nearby, someone's dog starts howling. A long, mournful note that sounds almost like a song. You listen until it fades into silence. The night deepens, soft and cool. Before you drift off, one last image: the village baker waking before dawn again tomorrow, kneading the same dough, feeding the same fire. The world will turn. The crops will grow. The gossip will evolve. But the heartbeat of ordinary life will go on, steady as a mill wheel. You realize you could stay here forever, in this quiet loop of chores and stories and soup. But history, like the seasons, never stands still. Somewhere beyond the fields, the sound of hooves approaches. A messenger, a rumor, the next upheaval already forming. You stand, brush hay from your cloak, and take one last look at the sleeping cottages. Rest well. You whisper to them, though you know they won't hear. The night answers with the soft sigh of the wind through the wheat. You smile, feeling its cool touch on your face, then turn toward the sound of distant thunder that isn't quite weather. The first thunder rolls in like a drumbeat from far away, not storm, but boots. The morning mist shivers as banners rise over the horizon, painted with lions, crosses, and the occasional questionable family emblem. One looks suspiciously like a chicken in armor. You're standing at the edge of another field now, but this one smells of tension instead of barley. The Middle Ages, next great obsession, is approaching, power in motion, knights in formation, the feudal dream flexing its muscles. You step aside as a column of armored men rides past, lances upright, horses breathing clouds. The ground trembles beneath you. This isn't battle yet. This is pageantry, rehearsal for history. A standard bearer flashes you a grin, his teeth startlingly white against the grime.
"We march for honor," he shouts, which you notice.
Sounds an awful lot like march for overtime. A mainstream fact, knights dominated Europe's military elite from the 11th to 15th centuries, bound by the chivalric code of loyalty, piety, and courtesy. The quirky part, that code often existed more in poetry than in practice. Historians still argue whether chivalry was moral reform or just good branding for professional killers. The camp is sprawling and alive. You walk among rows of tents, each marked with a family crest: stags, dragons, roses, the occasional badly drawn mermaid. Armor glints in the sun. Squires haul buckets of water and mutter under their breath. The smell is equal parts sweat, metal, and the faint tang of horse anxiety. A knight polishes his helmet beside you, humming off key. "It's all about reflection," he says, squinting at his own warped faceplate. "If you look heroic enough, the bards will make sure you stay that way." You can't argue with that logic. Nearby, a herald practices trumpeting. Poorly. The sound makes one of the horses rear, and a squire spill an entire bucket of wine. The knight sighs. At least the horse has taste. You wander to the training ground, where young men are jesting on splintered practice poles. The thud of impact echoes through the camp. A shield shatters, sending fragments flying into the mud. The crowd cheers. You realize this isn't just sport, it's rehearsal for survival. A mainstream fact, tournaments were as much social events as military practice, often lasting days and drawing crowds of nobles, merchants, and spectators. The quirky bit-losing knights sometimes had to forfeit their armor, which was so expensive that a bad jest could bankrupt them. Historians still argue whether tournaments encouraged chivalry or sheer recklessness. The next match begins. The riders lower their lances and charge. Dust explodes around them. You flinch as one man's helmet flies clean off, landing in your lap. Inside, you find a note that reads, "I've lost. Return to Sir Roland." You decide to keep it as a souvenir. Evening falls over the camp, painting everything bronze. The knights gather around fires, boasting about battles they've barely survived or completely fabricated. You listen quietly, half amused, half impressed. For all their violence, there's something childlike in their hunger for story. One of them mentions the Battle of Agincourt, where English longbowmen cut down French knights like wheat in 1415. The mainstream fact: muddy terrain and the deadly efficiency of longbows turned the tide for the vastly outnumbered English. The quirky note: English archers made rude hand gestures toward their enemies, showing the fingers they used to draw bows, as proof they hadn't been captured. Historians still argue whether that's the origin of a certain modern gesture, but you can guess which one. The conversation shifts from war to love, because knights never separate the two for long. One man quotes a troubadour's verse about a lady who wore his favour, a ribbon tied around his lance. Another scoffs, saying love is just distraction. Try wooing someone when you smell like boiled chainmail, he mutters. The firelight dances on their armor, and you realize chivalry isn't about being perfect, it's about pretending well. Past the campfires, you find the blacksmiths, the real heroes behind the spectacle. Sparks fly as they hammer out new blades, their rhythm steady and almost musical. A mainstream fact: medieval armor could weigh up to 60 pounds, but was surprisingly flexible, allowing knights to mount horses and even somersault, though preferably not during combat. The quirky side: one smith reportedly forged armor, reflective that birds tried to land on it. Historians still argue whether that anecdote was metaphor or marketing. The blacksmith wipes his brow and nods to you. Every dent tells a story, he says, holding up a breastplate scarred like a battlefield. You trace one groove and imagine the impact it took to make it. He smiles. And every scar means someone walked away. The night deepens, and you wander past the tents where the squires sleep, exhausted. A few whisper prayers, others snore like broken trumpets. Beyond them, the battlefield looms empty and waiting. The moon glints off helmets, lined up like silent sentinels. You crouch near a line of horses, dozing on their feet. One opens an eye to regard you unimpressed. You pat its neck. You're the smartest one here. You whisper, and it exhales as if agreeing. In the distance, you hear chanting, monks blessing the troops before dawn. You follow the sound to a makeshift altar draped in rough linen. The priest sprinkles holy water across the weapons, careful not to rust them. The soldiers kneel, murmuring oaths that feel heavy with both faith and fear. A mainstream fact: the church often sanctified battles, declaring them just wars. The quirky part: some knights carried saintly relics into combat, including a finger bone of St. George, or in one case, a splinter from the true cross, used as a lance tip. Historians still argue whether faith made them brave, or just superstitious with better PR. As dawn creeps in, the air hums with nerves. Armor clicks, banners rise, and someone starts a drumbeat that quickens every heartbeat around you. You stand among them as the army begins to move, an iron tide crawling across the landscape. The ground shakes, birds explode from the trees. Then, like smoke through the noise, you hear singing. Not war chants, but something softer, haunting. It's coming from the camp, followers trailing behind wives, widows, and healers carrying baskets of bandages and bread. One woman catches your eye and smiles faintly. She looks neither frightened nor hopeful, only tired. A mainstream fact: camp followers were vital to medieval armies, providing food, nursing, and morale. The quirky bit: they often kept better records of troop movements than official scribes. Historians still argue whether their work was recognized service or invisible labor. You know the answer: it's both, and mostly the latter. By noon, the battle smoke thickens. You don't see much fighting, just flashes of chaos, the clang of metal, and the dull thud of exhaustion. When it's over, No one looks like a hero. They just look older. In the quiet aftermath, you walk among the survivors. One knight sits on a fallen log, staring at his gauntlets. Chivalry's easier when no one's bleeding, he mutters. You hand him back his helmet, the one with the note. He laughs weakly. Wes, you earned your favor. The camp rebuilds itself with wary efficiency. Tents go up again, fires relit, wounds bound. Someone plays a soft tune on a flute, trying to remind everyone what peace sounds like. You sit and listen, letting the notes wash the iron taste from your mouth. As twilight falls, you climb a small hill overlooking the field. From here, the battlefield looks almost serene. Rows of trampled grass glowing silver under the moon. You wonder how many stories will rise from this one day, dressed up as glory. A soft rain begins, washing mud and memory alike. You lift your face to it, feeling the coolness slide down your skin. For a moment, you think of all the knights who came before, charging into legend, and realize they weren't chasing honor. They were running from insignificance. You whisper a small joke to the wind. Maybe next time, we just settle disputes with a bake-off. Somewhere, a thunderclap almost sounds like laughter. The rain thickens, turning the field into a mirror. You see your own reflection there, blurred and uncertain, surrounded by ghosts in shining armor who never really left. You nod to them, not as judge or admirer, but as witness. When you walk away, the campfires flicker behind you like stars trying to stay awake. You keep walking until the sound of armor fades, replaced by the whisper of wet grass beneath your boots. You don't know where history will take you next, but you know this much glory rusts fast. But stories, those stay polished forever. The rain fades behind you, leaving the air cool and damp as you wander into the fog. The forest thickens around you, its breath warm and alive. The world seems quieter here, until you notice the faint scent of smoke. Not the clean, campfire kind, but the bitter curl of something far more nervous. You follow it, weaving between gnarled oaks and slick roots, until you reach a clearing bathed in silver moonlight. A crowd gathers around a wooden post at the center. Their faces glow orange from torchlight, eyes wide, voices low. Someone's whispering a prayer. Someone else is clutching a charm shaped like a tiny broom. You already know what this is. You've walked into one of history's most fevered dreams, the witch hunts. The mainstream fact, between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft across Europe. The quirky fact, many of the accused were midwives, herbalists, or simply women who owned too many cats. Historians still argue whether witch trials were about religion, misogyny, or just mass hysteria dressed up as righteousness. You stand among the villagers as a figure is led to the post. Her hair is tangled, her dress muddy, but her face is calm. You wonder how. A priest reads from a parchment that sounds more like theater than justice. The wind tugs at his robes, and somewhere behind you, a child coughs. When the torchlight flares brighter, you flinch. But before the story turns grim, let's take a breath. You remind yourself this is bedtime history, not midnight horror. We'll stay soft. And maybe you'll sleep better, knowing the flames are far away and centuries gone. You turn from the fire toward the edge of the crowd, where two scholars argue in hushed tones. One insists witches drew their power from the devil. The other says it was all superstition and social panic. They both look exhausted, like men who've read too many pamphlets and not enough poetry. One of them mutters, "They say witches fly, but no one ever asks where they're going." You smile. It's a fair question. A mainstream fact. Witches, Sabbaths, were described as night gatherings involving flight, feasting, and strange rituals, often shaped more by imagination than observation. The quirky tidbit early accounts mention flying ointments, potions mixed with hallucinogenic herbs like belladonna or henbane. Historians still argue whether those potions caused real visions or just very vivid naps. You imagine it for a moment, you, floating over medieval rooftops, your cloak snapping in the cold wind, a wooden broomstick creaking under you. Below, the world sleeps, and for once, you're above the fear instead of inside it. The thought feels oddly freeing. The village fades behind you as you drift onward, your mind still flickering with that image of moonlit flight. Ahead lies another town, smaller, poorer, but buzzing with gossip. You pass a tavern where men trade stories about shape, shifting wolves, milk that curdles on command, and hens that lay blood, red eggs. A barmaid polishing mugs looks up at you. "Don't listen," she says. "They'll call anyone a witch if the crops fail." Her tone is casual, but her eyes dart toward the window. You follow her gaze to a scarecrow standing in the field. A crooked silhouette with a bundle of herbs tied around its neck. Protection or warning? Hard to say. The barmaid leans closer. "You want to know a secret?" she whispers. "Half of them are right." Then she winks and walks away before you can ask what she means. A mainstream fact. Folk magic and herbal medicine were common throughout rural Europe. People used charms, sigils, and simple rituals for luck or healing. The quirky part, witch bottles, filled with nails, hair, and urine, were buried under doorsteps to ward off curses. Historians still argue whether those bottles worked, or just made archaeologists' jobs more awkward. You leave the tavern and wander down a narrow lane. The fog curls low, thick as wool. Somewhere ahead, you hear chanting. Soft, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. You follow it to a cottage half, buried in ivy. The door creaks open, and a woman steps out holding a bundle of herbs. She doesn't look wicked. She looks tired. Her hands are stained green from work, her smile small but kind. "You've come for a cure?" she asks. You nod, even though you're not sick. Inside, the air smells of rosemary and old wood smoke. Bottles line the shelves, filled with powders and roots. "People think this is witchcraft," she says, grinding something in a mortar. "But it's just knowing what grows where." A mainstream fact. Midwives and healers often became targets of witchcraft accusations because their knowledge threatened the church's control over health and miracle making. The quirky twist, some spells were just old recipes with poetic names, like dragon's breath for garlic or grave moss for thyme. Historians still argue whether these women were persecuted for power, medicine, or both. You watch her mix a salve of honey, salt, and crushed leaves. "This," she says, handing you a small jar, "as for nightmares." You ask if it works. She shrugs. "Depends how badly you want to wake up." As you step outside again, the fog has lifted a little. The moonlight paints everything pale silver, softening the edges of the world. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howls, and you're not sure if it's real or just the forest stretching. You walk until dawn begins to breathe color into the sky. The path leads to a ruined abbey where ivy curls around broken stone. Inside, two monks argue over a faded book. You creep closer. "See," says one, pointing to a marginal note.
"It says the witch turned him into a frog!"
The other frowns. "No, brother. It says the fish burned in the fog." Your Latin is tragic. You stifle a laugh. Even monks, it seems, can't resist a good story. A mainstream fact. Many witchcraft manuals, like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, were written by clergy who mixed scripture, folklore, and personal paranoia into one volatile brew. The quirky tidbit: the book sold better than most Bibles in its time. Historians still argue whether it spread belief in witches or just capitalized on fear. You wander the cloisters as light filters through shattered, stained glass. The colored fragments paint your hands in crimson and gold. You imagine how many prayers bounced off these walls unanswered. Maybe some of them still echo. Outside the abbey, the air hums faintly. as if the forest itself remembers. You pass a stream, where women once washed linen in the moonlight, singing to keep the water calm. Some said those songs could charm fish or curse lovers. You hum one softly, and the water ripples in reply. By noon, you reach a marketplace where witch hunters boast of their exploits. One waves a pouch filled with bones, claiming it belonged to a shape-shifting hag. Another sells pamphlets detailing how to spot a witch: red hair, moles, a cat, a sense of humor. You realize, grimly, that you'd fail every one of those tests. A mainstream fact, witch hunters were often self-proclaimed experts who profited from accusations, moving from town to town like grim entrepreneurs. The quirky note one famous hunter, Matthew Hopkins, the so-called witch-finder general, charged by the head. Historians still argue whether he believed his own sermons or just loved the coin. As the sun dips again, you find a quiet hill overlooking the town. From here, the rooftops look peaceful. Smoke rises from chimneys, and church bells chime softly. You close your eyes and think of all the people who lived in fear, and all the ones who quietly refused to be afraid. You remember the healer's words, "It's just knowing what grows where." You picture those herbs: lavender for calm, sage for cleansing, thyme for courage. Maybe history, too, can heal if you know what to mix together. You reach into your pocket and feel the jar she gave you. The salve smells faintly of honey and mint. You dab a bit on your wrist, just to see. The scent lingers, sweet, earthy, steady. Maybe it's not magic, but it helps. You lean back against the grass and let the stars drift overhead. The world feels quieter again, as if it's catching its breath after centuries of shouting. You smile faintly and whisper, "Maybe we were all witches once." The wind answers, rustling the trees like pages turning. Somewhere, a barn owl calls, soft and low, its wings brushing the night. You close your eyes, feeling the air move over you, and for a moment, you imagine yourself weightless, rising, drifting, flying into the fog, carried by nothing but quiet belief. The night sky you drift beneath begins to fade into a bruised grey, and you feel the pull of another century curling at the edges of your mind. The witches and healers dissolve into mist, and in their place, stone towers grow. Flags flutter on their peaks, and from every window spills the faint glow of ambition. You find yourself walking along a castle wall, so high it seems to scrape the belly of dawn. The stones beneath your feet hum with secrets, and down below, a drawbridge groans open for another parade of noble egos. Welcome to the age of princes, pretenders, and paper crowns, where bloodlines were brittle. Ink was a weapon, and one good rumor could dethrone a king. Your boots echo in the corridor as you pass portraits whose eyes seem to follow you. The first is a boy, barely 13, draped in velvet too heavy for his shoulders. He's one of history's most unfortunate job applicants. Edward V of England, one of the princes in the Tower, a mainstream fact. Edward and his younger brother were taken to the Tower of London in 1483, after their father's death. They were never seen again. The quirky detail. Centuries later, 2 small skeletons were discovered beneath a staircase, sparking endless speculation. Historians still argue whether their uncle, Richard E. Thew, ordered their deaths, or if they escaped and lived quietly under new names. You walk deeper into the hall, past a suit of armor that looks slightly embarrassed to still be standing. A breeze whispers through the arrow slits, carrying the faint scent of ink and dust. Around the next corner, you find a scribe hunched over a scroll, muttering. Another claimant. He groans, dipping his quill. Third one this week. He gestures to a list of names, so long it looks like a medieval customer complaint form. The half of them can't even spell their royal titles right. You peek at the parchment and stifle a chuckle. Someone has written Prince of all things. Maybe. The scribe sighs. Pretenders, he says, shaking his head. always think they're born lucky. Never read the fine print. You leave him to his ink, stained misery, and follow the sound of clinking goblets. A feast is underway in the great hall, full of velvet, laughter, and lies. Courtiers flatter like artists painting invisible portraits, each compliment meant to hide a dagger. At the high table sits a queen with a smile sharper than her crown. Her gown sparkles like a constellation, and every movement is practiced. Measured, deliberate. Her name, Margaret of Anjou, the so-called she-wolf of France. A mainstream fact. Margaret was the formidable queen consort of Henry VI during England's Wars of the Roses. She led armies, negotiated truces, and terrified rivals. The quirky part. She was once described by an enemy chronicler as a great and strong, laboured woman, in likeness of a man. Historians still argue whether that was an insult or an unintended compliment. She raises a goblet and toasts the room. To loyalty, she says, and half the guests nearly choke on the irony. You sip from a nearby cup, and nearly choke too. It's wine so sour it could dissolve armour. At the edge of the hall, a minstrel strums his lute and sings about another pretender, a boy who claimed to be one of those lost princes. His name Perkin Warbeck, the man who fooled half of Europe into believing he was royalty reborn. A mainstream fact. Warbeck, in the late 1400s, convinced foreign courts and even the King of Scotland that he was the rightful heir to the English throne. The quirky bit, he was executed for treason. But his charm was such that his jailers reportedly dined with him before his death. Historians still argue whether he was delusional, daring, or simply the best con man of his age. You imagine him now, lean, bright-eyed, adjusting his borrowed finery as if it actually fits. He bows to you in a candle-lit corridor, saying, "Fake it till you make it, my friend." You whisper back, "You did," for a while. The castle shifts again, its stones rearranging like chess pieces, and you're suddenly standing on the ramparts of another fortress. The air is colder, the sky deeper. Below, a city glimmers by a river. You hear the clatter of hooves, messengers racing, banners fluttering with unfamiliar coats of arms. This is France now, the age of Valois and Bourbon, where every prince seems to be at war with his own reflection. A man in a crimson cloak stands beside you, staring toward the horizon. "They call me king," he says, "but my brothers call me target." His name is Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, warrior, dreamer, collector of shiny regrets. A mainstream fact. Charles sought to turn Burgundy into a European super kingdom in the 15th century. The quirky note. He once kept a personal astrologer in his tent, who advised him on the best days to start wars. Historians still argue whether his downfall came from bad luck or bad scheduling. The Duke glances at you, eyes tired. "We're all chasing crowns," he murmurs. "Even the ones we already wear." Then he turns and walks into the mist, swallowed by his own ambition. You follow his trail into another hall of mirrors. This one metaphorical, reflecting countless royal impostors. Each face flickers and fades. Lambert Simnel, crowned in Dublin as a fake king. Anna Anderson, centuries later, claiming to be the lost Romanov princess, because imposter fever never really dies. You sense a pattern here. Humans will believe anything wrapped in gold leaf. The air thickens again, and suddenly you're in Florence, standing beside a young Machiavelli as he scribbles in a notebook. He glances up, smirking. "Everyone wants to be a prince," he says, "but no one wants to do the paperwork." A mainstream fact. Nickel, Machiavelli's The Prince. 15 distilled power into practical, sometimes ruthless advice for rulers. The quirky detail. The book wasn't intended as a villain's manual. It was a desperate job application to win favour from the Medici. Historians still argue whether he meant his cynicism sincerely or sarcastically. You peek at his manuscript. The ink smells sharp and smoky. "Better to be feared than loved," he mutters, then adds quietly, unless you're trying to sleep at night. A bell tolls in the distance, echoing through the Renaissance streets. Somewhere nearby, a printing press thuds, a new machine that will make kings' proclamations and pretenders' lies equally permanent. You step closer, watching sheets of paper roll out like spells. Words, it seems, have replaced swords as the sharper weapon. A printer hands you a fresh page, still damp with ink. It's a declaration of succession. You read the names, half of them already crossed out. They never last, the printer says with a shrug. But the paper does. By twilight, you're standing at a crossroads. One path leads to England again, the other to Spain. You choose England. It's always got drama brewing. The air there smells of sea salt and scandal. You find yourself outside Hampton Court, the red brick palace of Henry Viddy, the heavyweight champion of marital chaos. Inside, the king struts like a rooster in silk, while courtiers pretend his latest annulment is strategic. A mainstream fact: Henry VI married 6 times between 1509 and 1547, reshaping religion itself to accommodate his divorces. The quirky part: he once issued a royal decree banning beards at court, unless you paid a beard tax. Historians still argue whether that rule was about hygiene, or just Henry's jealousy of better jawlines. You watch him sign yet another order, his quill snapping under pressure. The parchment trembles in the candlelight. Paper crowns again. Fragile symbols of control. Behind him, tapestries depict saints and sinners, both wearing suspiciously similar robes. When Henry storms off to find his dinners, and probably another wife, you wander into the garden. The air smells of lavender and whetstone. A peacock strots by, unimpressed by monarchy. You chuckle softly. You'd make a better king. You tell it. The bird spreads its feathers in agreement. A courtier nearby overhears and laughs nervously. Careful, he whispers. That's treason if anyone else hears. You grin. Everything's treason eventually. You leave Hampton Court as night returns, carrying the echo of royal footsteps behind you. Every tower, every crown you've seen tonight feels strangely hollow, beautiful but temporary. Pretenders, princes, conquerors, lovers. They all chased the same shimmer of power and left behind piles of parchment to prove it. At the edge of the palace garden, you find a single piece of paper caught on a thorn bush. You pull it free and read the faded ink. All thrones are borrowed. You fold it gently and tuck it into your sleeve. The wind picks up, tugging at your cloak, whispering through the trees like gossip. Somewhere far off, a bell rings again. Not for coronation, not for death, just for time passing, steady and unbothered. You start walking toward it, your steps slow and even. The path ahead flickers between candlelight and shadow, as if history itself can't decide which story it prefers. And as you walk, you can't help but smile. You've met the kings who couldn't sleep, the queens who never blinked, and the impostors who dreamed bigger than their lives. In the end, you realize they all wore paper crowns. But maybe that's what makes them human. The bell's echo stretches like smoke through the night, and when it fades, you find yourself standing in a city you don't recognize. The air tastes like damp stone and ink. The streets twist like questions no one wants to answer. A mist coils low to the cobblestones, muffling the sound of your steps. You glance around. The houses are close, too close. The lamps burn low. The silence feels deliberate. And then you see it, a figure slipping between doorways, silent as breath, a glint of metal at their belt. The next story isn't about thrones or crowns. It's about the people who made sure thrones changed hands when words weren't enough. Welcome to the world of assassins in the fog. You follow that glinting shadow through the narrow alleys of medieval Venice. The city is half dream, half conspiracy, a maze of bridges and secrets, where masks aren't just for festivals. The water below reflects the moon in 1,000 trembling pieces. Somewhere, A lute plays softly, and the notes shiver in the damp air. A mainstream fact. Venice was a hub of intrigue during the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, ruled by a council that thrived on espionage. Its infamous Council of Ten used secret informants to track enemies of the state. The quirky bit, there were real lions' mouths carved into public walls, where citizens could drop anonymous denunciations. Historians still argue whether this made Venice safer, or just sneakier. You pause beside one of those stone mouths now, its grin half erased by moss. Someone slides a folded note into it and vanishes. You can't help but peek. The message says only, "The Doge sleeps tonight." You move on before curiosity turns into liability. Around the next corner, the shadow you've been following stops at a door, taps twice, and slips inside. You wait a moment, then follow. Inside, candles burn low over a round table. Men and women in dark cloaks sit silently, faces hidden by masks of black velvet. The air smells of wax and old fear. A map lies in the center, pins marking names and routes across Europe. One of them looks up and says softly, "You're late." You open your mouth to explain you're just visiting, but the leader waves a gloved hand. It doesn't matter. The work always continues. A mainstream fact? Political assassinations were an accepted, if unofficial, tool of statecraft throughout the Middle Ages. The quirky detail, one 14th century mercenary claimed to specialize in accidental deaths, like stair collapses or poisoned ink wells. Historians still argue whether he was real or just a rumor crafted to keep nobles paranoid. A man in the corner sharpens a dagger. The sound scrapes like teeth. He gestures to you with the blade. "Everyone thinks we love blood," he says. "But really, we love silence." That sentence hangs in the air as you drift away, your heartbeat slow and steady. Outside, Venice fades, and you're suddenly in another city. This one climbing the hills of Jerusalem. The sun here is merciless. The stones glare white. You hear a voice chanting from a nearby tower, echoing across time itself. You've stepped into the realm of the Hashishin, the word that birthed assassin. A mainstream fact, the Nizari Ismailis, a Shia Muslim sect in the 11th, 13th centuries, built mountain fortresses in Persia and Syria. They used strategic targeted killings to defend their autonomy against much larger powers. The quirky note. Some chroniclers claimed their initiates were drugged with hashish before missions, though modern historians still argue whether that was propaganda or misunderstanding. You climb a narrow path toward one of their fortresses, Alamet, the eagle's nest. The air grows thinner, cooler. Every step feels like a secret test. At the top, a man in white robes stands watching the horizon. His voice, when he speaks, is calm. "Everyone below fights wars," he says. "We fight mistakes." He turns to you and smiles faintly. "History calls us killers, but we were gardeners. We pruned the diseased branches before the tree died." You can't tell whether that comforts you or chills you. He gestures to the valley below, dotted with fires. Every leader out there believes themselves eternal. We remind them they are not, as night falls. The fortress glows like an ember in the dark. You hear the faint clatter of weapons being cleaned, and the whisper of paper. Names being written, erased, rewritten. A mainstream fact, the Hashashin's influence stretched across decades. Even Saladin, the great Muslim leader, reportedly survived an assassination attempt by them. The quirky part, after one failed attempt, the assassins left a dagger on his pillow as a warning. Historians still argue whether that story's true, or simply too perfect not to be. You leave Alamet and drift across the centuries, through shadows and kingdoms. Every age, it seems, breeds its own quiet executioners. Now, you stand in Avignon, France, papal territory in the 14th century. Cardinals whisper behind closed doors, while servants sweep ashes that look suspiciously like burned letters. In a corner, a young clerk scribbles furiously in Latin. You glance over his shoulder and see the phrase, "poison in chalice." He quickly crosses it out. The court of popes and kings. Everyone here has something to hide. A ring glints on the table, carved with the image of a skull. You lean closer and notice a hollow compartment beneath the gemstone. A poison ring. A mainstream fact. Renaissance Italy perfected the art of political poisoning, using arsenic mixtures nicknamed inheritance powders. The quirky detail. Testers once dipped a silver spoon into food to detect poison, believing it would tarnish instantly. Except, of course, it didn't always. Historians still argue whether poisonings were as common as legend says, or simply the easiest excuse for inconvenient deaths. The clerk looks up at you nervously. "No one dies naturally anymore," he whispers. "They just die politely." You walk through Avignon's narrow streets, where fountains gurgle softly. In the distance, church bells ring, each tone careful and measured. The sound makes you think of locked doors, of prayers whispered with one eye open. Then, another shift. The stones underfoot change, the air grows damp, and you're back in England, this time in a London alley behind the palace. The fog is thicker here, hugging the ground. The sound of horses fades, the only noise is your breath. Someone moves beside you. A figure in dark wool, holding a crossbow small enough to hide under a cloak. He nods once, not to you, but to the silence between you. "It's not murder," he murmurs. "It's maintenance." A mainstream fact. Political assassinations shaped English history more than most realize. From Thomas Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral, a 107ers, to the mysterious death of Edward II. The quirky tidbit in one case, a royal courtier's death was blamed on excessive dancing. Historians still argue whether that's code for poison, or just terrible cardio. The assassin raises his crossbow, aims at a window above, then lowers it again. "Not tonight," he says softly. Some stories need longer endings. He vanishes into the fog before you can reply. You wander toward the river. The Thames glows faintly under the moon, carrying whispers from every age. You think about all the unseen hands that guided history. The letters never sent, the blades never drawn, the breaths held a second too long. A boat passes silently, its lantern swinging. Inside, two masked figures sit facing each other. One asks, "Is it done?" The other nods. It was done before it began. You almost laugh. Assassins speak in riddles, poets in rhyme, kings in decrees. Everyone just wants to sound immortal. The wind picks up, rattling the water against the docks. A scroll floats past, half-soaked, ink bleeding like a wound. You fish it out and read the first line. "The man who changes the world is rarely the one crowned for it." You fold it and keep it. Another souvenir for your growing collection of misplaced wisdom. As dawn creeps in, the fog thins, and you see London's skyline emerge. The spires, the bridges, the restless hum of a city that never stops scheming. Above it all, pigeons gather on rooftops, looking remarkably like spies waiting for breakfast. You smile, exhausted but amused. Even the birds have agendas. You whisper. A final mainstream fact throughout the Middle Ages. Trained carrier pigeons were used to deliver coded messages across battlefields. The quirky part, some nobles refused to trust them, claiming birds could be bribed by rival houses. Historians still argue whether that was paranoia or just a really bad understanding of ornithology. You watch those birds take flight, scattering like thoughts across a grey sky. The city below stirs awake, bakers lighting fires, guards yawning, merchants unlocking shutters. No one notices the quiet ghosts that move among them, the ones who made history by erasing others. You turn away from the rooftops and begin walking again, the cobblestones cold under your boots. Every step sounds like punctuation, soft, final, inevitable. When you reach the edge of the river, you look back once. The fog swirls and folds, and for a heartbeat, you think you see them all. The assassins of Venice, The agents of Alamet, the poisoners of Avignon, standing side by side in the mist. Watching, waiting. Then they fade, and only the dawn remains. You exhale slowly, realizing how quiet the world has become. No swords, no whispers, no names. Just peace. For now. The river fades beneath your feet like a dream you've just stepped out of. The morning light wobbles, turns amber, then melts into the gleam of molten gold. You blink, and suddenly, you're standing inside a workshop. Dust motes float in sunlight that pours through a cracked window. The air smells of oil, beeswax, and burning possibility. Brushes lean drunkenly in a cup. A half-finished painting stares at you from a wooden easel and on a nearby table. An open book smolders slightly, as if its own words couldn't contain themselves. This, apparently, is where history hides its messiest geniuses, the artists. Alchemists and accidental criminals. You pick up a quill and almost immediately knock over a bottle of something labeled aqua vita. It hisses when it hits the wood, and you jump back. A voice from behind a stack of parchment says, "Careful, that's my experiment. I'm still not sure whether it cures headaches or dissolves fingertips." You turn to find a man with paint on his hands and stubble on his chin. His smile is distracted, the kind of grin that says his brain left the room 3 ideas ago. A mainstream fact. The line between art and science in the medieval and early Renaissance world was practically invisible. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Roger Bacon, and Paracelsus studied anatomy, flight, chemistry, and astronomy under the same flickering candles. The quirky bit. Some of them were accused of witchcraft, simply for writing in mirrored script. Because it looked like the devil's handwriting. Historians still argue whether those accusations were superstition or subtle academic jealousy. The man gestures toward a canvas. "See that?" he asks. Everyone thinks it's just paint, but it's also crushed lapis, egg yolk, and vinegar. That blue is worth more than gold. I'm painting with bankruptcy. You grin. Seems expensive for something that might just fade. He shrugs. So do kingdoms. The candle flickers, and the whole workshop smells suddenly of damp plaster and imagination. You drift between tables, some covered with pigments, others with strange metal tools. There's a jar of what looks suspiciously like pickled frogs labeled failures. A rat in the corner seems to nod in agreement. He notices your curiosity. "I used to paint saints," he murmurs. "Now I paint possibilities. The church pays better, but the stars are quieter." As he turns back to his work, you notice a second figure across the room. An alchemist hunched over a small furnace, muttering to himself. His robe is singed. His beard smells faintly of copper, and his hands tremble from too much caffeine or too many curses. He holds up a vial of golden liquid and says, "Almost a mainstream fact. Medieval alchemists genuinely believed in the transmutation of base metals into gold, and the search for the philosopher's stone." The quirky detail. Some believed the stone could also grant immortality, though many of them died of mercury poisoning long before finding out. Historians still argue whether alchemy was proto-science or proto-madness, or maybe both. You ask him what he's trying to make. He squints, his eyes glowing like embers. "Perfection," he says. But perfection keeps running late. He pours the golden liquid onto a piece of dull iron. Nothing happens, he sighs. Back to despair then. You can't help but chuckle, which earns a half smile from him. "Laugh while you can," he says. "Someday, someone will turn this nonsense into chemistry, and they'll call me superstitious." He's not wrong. You wander out of the workshop and into a narrow street filled with artisans of every persuasion. Bells chime somewhere above, and the smell of freshly cut marble mingles with that of bread. You pass a sculptor hammering at a block of stone. He pauses to wipe his brow and says, "I'm freeing angels one mistake at a time." Farther down, A young woman sketches designs for flying machines. The drawings look like bird skeletons wearing umbrellas. She sees your expression and laughs. They said humans weren't meant to fly, she says. They also said the world was flat. 2 lies, 1 century. A mainstream fact: early engineers like Da Vinci sketched designs for helicopters, gliders, and parachutes centuries before they were possible. The quirky tidbit: some of those designs were later used as coded metaphors for spiritual ascent in secret mystical texts. Historians still argue whether those artists truly aimed for flight, or were just showing off their metaphors. You sit beside her, watching ink turn into ambition. "You really think people will fly?" you ask. She grins. "People already do, just not with wings." The sound of hammers and bells fades, replaced by a quieter rhythm, scratching quills, bubbling flasks. The heartbeat of curiosity itself. You wander toward a dimly lit study, where a man in scholar's robes sits surrounded by parchment towers. He looks up, eyes sharp behind spectacles. "You want to know what makes the universe run?" he asks. Patience. And ink. He slides a page toward you filled with numbers and circles. "I'm charting the movement of the stars. The church says the heavens are perfect. I say they wobble." A mainstream fact. Medieval astronomers like Nicolaus Oresme and later Copernicus began to challenge geocentric views even before the Renaissance fully bloomed. The quirky detail. Some wrote under pseudonyms to avoid accusations of heresy. Historians still argue whether their heliocentric hints were bold rebellion or cautious self-preservation. You trace a circle on the page. "So what happens if you're right?" He shrugs. "Then everything wrong is finally beautiful again." There's something soothing about the way he says it. You lean back and close your eyes for a moment. Somewhere in the distance, a lute begins to play. A melody soft enough to loosen thoughts, but sharp enough to keep them from slipping away. When you open your eyes, the room has changed again. You're now in a candlelit cellar. Shelves line the walls, packed with glass jars filled with liquids of every color. A woman stands in the center, her sleeves rolled up, stirring something in a pot that smells like burnt almonds and ambition. She glances over and says, "Relax. It's perfume." Probably a mainstream fact. Apothecaries in medieval cities often doubled as perfumers, chemists, and occasional poisoners, since all 3 relied on similar ingredients. The quirky bit. Certain perfumes were considered love charms, while others were worn to ward off plague. Historians still argue whether scent making was art, alchemy, or subtle warfare. She hands you a vial. This one's called EUD influence. You take a cautious sniff. It smells like honey, iron, and a mild threat. "You wear it," she says, "when you want someone to agree with you without knowing why." You laugh softly. "And does it work?" She shrugs. "You tell me." The candlelight dances in her eyes, and you realize that for centuries, history's most dangerous experiments weren't always about gold or glory. They were about control. The mind, the will, the scent of persuasion. You leave her cellar with your head pleasantly foggy. The night outside feels warm and alive. Lanterns sway in the wind. You pass taverns full of laughter and half-drunk poetry, then a monastery where the only sound is a quill scratching at midnight. Inside that monastery, a monk is copying a forbidden text. A scientific treatise smuggled from the east. He looks up briefly as you pass. "Knowledge," he whispers, "is a candle. The church keeps trying to cup its hand around it." A mainstream fact. Monasteries preserved and sometimes censored vast collections of ancient knowledge during the Middle Ages. The quirky part. Marginal doodles in those manuscripts sometimes included rabbits wielding swords or nuns chasing snails. Historians still argue whether that was satire, boredom, or divine whimsy. You stop to look at one of those doodles, a tiny knight fighting a snail 10 times his size, and chuckle. Art imitates life. You murmur. The monk grins. Sometimes it escapes it. You leave him to his work, stepping back into the night. Above you, stars pulse faintly, like drops of mercury spilled across the sky. Somewhere, a clock tower counts the hours in size. You think of all the painters and dreamers you've met tonight. People who dared to create things the world wasn't ready for. They mixed curiosity with chaos and called it progress. Some of them were branded heretics. Others became legends. Most just got paint in their hair. The wind smells faintly of turpentine and roses. You can almost hear history turning pages in its sleep. Funny, you whisper. Ho genius always looks like trouble until it pays off. In the distance, a rooster crows, either too early or centuries too late. You smile and keep walking. Somewhere ahead, another idea is catching fire. You keep walking, though the air around you changes again. The scents of turpentine and metal fade, replaced by a faint sweetness. Grass, dew, something green and alive. The ground beneath your feet feels uneven now, soft in places, rough in others. You glance down and realize you're stepping through tall, whispering weeds. When you look up, the horizon is painted in soft grey. The world stretches wide, calm, and heartbreakingly quiet. And there it is, a battlefield, or what's left of one. You stop at the edge. The earth rolls out before you, gentle and innocent now, except for the subtle scars, a dip where trenches once ran, a line of darker soil that hints at something buried below. Wildflowers sway in the breeze. They've claimed the ground that once trembled under armor. Tonight's story leads you here, to the wars that forgot their winners. A skylark trills above, and you almost smile. It's hard to imagine this place once echoed with the clash of steel and the screams of men who thought glory meant noise. A mainstream fact. The 100 Years' War between England and France stretched from 1337 to 1453. An epic feud that redefined medieval politics and warfare. The quirky detail, it actually lasted 116 years, which is the kind of math only politicians could love. Historians still argue whether it was one long war or a messy collection of smaller grudges wearing matching uniforms. You walk forward slowly, your boots brushing over moss and memory. A rusty helmet half, buried in the ground, catches the light. You pick it up. It's heavier than you expect, cold and dented. Inside, there's a spider web glittering like lace. Every empire ends in cobwebs, you whisper. Somewhere behind you, a voice answers, soft, tired, but still proud. And every soldier becomes a story. You turn, and there he stands, a phantom in faded armor, eyes as dull as weathered stone. His banner droops at his side, the fabric tattered but still trying to be brave. Who won? You ask quietly. He smiles faintly. Depends who's telling it. You nod. Of course it does. The wind stirs, carrying faint echoes of a long ago trumpet. You start walking beside him, both of you silent for a while. He finally speaks again. They said it was for honor, or God, or the king. But mostly, it was for habit. No one wanted to stop fighting first. A mainstream fact in medieval Europe. Wars often continued for generations simply because peace treaties were politically inconvenient. The quirky tidbit during truces. Knights sometimes held tournaments together, mock battles that occasionally turned real again halfway through. Historians still argue whether those events were chivalry, boredom, or collective denial. The ghost laughs softly. We were all exhausted, but no one wanted to blink. You both reach a shallow hill. From here, you can see a small village in the distance. A patchwork of thatch, and hope rebuilt over ruins. Smoke curls from chimneys. Children chase each other through fields that once held arrows. You sit down on the hill. The ghost remains standing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. They'll forget us soon, he says. And that's fine. Forgetting's how the world heals. You nod again, though part of you wonders. Maybe forgetting is also how it repeats itself. You reach for your flask, Not that it's real here, and take a slow, imaginary sip. The ghost chuckles, still drinking water like it's wine. I see. Hydration is heroic. You mumble. He fades, his laughter dissolving into the air. The breeze carries it away like a promise that someone, somewhere, still remembers his name. Even if it's just you. You rise and start walking again. The fields shift around you, colors changing, as if someone keeps adjusting the world's saturation. Now you're on another plain, the soil darker, the sky bruised with smoke. This time, the sound is closer. Horses snort. Drums beat. You're walking into another war. The Crusades, maybe. Or one of the endless regional feuds that Europe bred like mushrooms. A mainstream fact. The Crusades were not a single war, but a series of religious campaigns spanning over 2 centuries, involving not only Christians and Muslims, but also rival Christian factions. The quirky detail crusaders sometimes carried relics, bones, thorns, or splinters of holy wood, into battle as talismans. Historians still argue whether those charms were faith or fear insurance. You step through the haze, past tents and broken spears. The air smells like salt and sweat. Somewhere nearby, someone's praying too loudly. You find another soldier, sitting alone by a campfire, sharpening his sword, though the blade's long since dulled. "It's not the fighting that's hard," he says without looking up. "It's the waiting between." He looks up then, eyes dark with exhaustion. "You think anyone remembers what we were promised?" You shake your head. "Didn't think so," he mutters. You sit beside him, and for a while, you both stare into the fire. Sparks drift upward like restless souls trying to join the stars. The war shifts again. Now it's the Mongol campaigns sweeping across Asia, then the endless sieges of Byzantium, then the Wars of the Roses in England, where cousins fought cousins for a crown shaped like irony. You find yourself inside a cold castle hallway, where torches tremble against the walls. The floor beneath your boots feels sticky, not with blood now, but with centuries of politics. A mainstream fact, during the Wars of the Roses, 1455-1487, both the House of Lancaster and the House of York claimed legitimate right to the English throne. The quirky tidbit. Their symbols, the red and white roses, were likely chosen after the fact, when chroniclers wanted a tidy metaphor. Historians still argue whether anyone in the actual war cared about flowers. You brush a wilted rose petal from your sleeve. Probably not. You murmur. A servant hurries past, eyes down. A noblewoman's voice echoes from a nearby chamber. Tell them we're winning. Even if we're not. You smirk. Medieval PR at its finest. Through a window, you see a field littered with abandoned armor and broken standards. The sky's turning pink. The kind of soft, forgiving color that looks like peace, but really just means everyone's too tired to keep fighting. You step outside again. The breeze carries birdsong and the distant murmur of peasants rebuilding walls. Someone's hanging laundry where trebuchets once stood. Life resumes, messy but stubborn. A mainstream fact after major medieval wars, ordinary citizens often repurpose battlefield materials. Swords reforged into tools, armor melted down for nails. The quirky note. Archaeologists have found plowshares made from old lance tips. Historians still argue whether that was pragmatism or poetry. You kneel in the grass and pick up a small piece of rusted metal. It's the corner of a shield, etched with what's left of a motto. You rub the dirt away. It says simply, "We tried." You whisper, "That's enough." The light shifts again, this time slower, gentler. You find yourself at a long wooden table in a monastery refectory. Men in brown robes sit quietly, eating bread and broth. No banners, no armor, no speeches. Just the sound of spoons and humility. One of the monks looks up at you. "War fades faster than bread goes stale," he says. "But pride molds faster." You can't help but grin. "That's surprisingly poetic," he shrugs. God likes punchlines. The others laugh softly. For a moment, even the walls seem to breathe. When you leave the monastery, the world outside feels brighter. Maybe it's spring. Maybe it's just peace trying to remember how to exist. You walk along a riverbank, where young trees lean over the water. Their roots grip the soil that once drank soldiers' blood. It's not sacred ground anymore, just ground. You stop and watch a heron glide across the surface, slow and deliberate. It lands, stares at you for a heartbeat, then dips its beak and pulls out a fish. Dinner, not destiny. And just like that, you feel something loosen in your chest. Maybe that's what these wars taught. The universe doesn't need victors, it just needs quiet. The sky darkens again, though this time it feels comforting. The first stars appear, blinking awake. Somewhere nearby, someone strums a lute, singing softly about kings no one remembers. You sit in the grass, lean back, and let your eyes drift shut. Somewhere deep beneath you, bones turn to dust. Armor rusts into nothing. The world, patient as ever, keeps growing things on top of its tragedies. You sigh and whisper, "Here's to the ones who lost beautifully." A soft breeze answers, carrying the scent of clover and rain. You smile, half asleep now. The wars have finally quieted. The smell of clover fades, replaced by candle wax, parchment, and the faint hum of human vanity. When you open your eyes, the world has shifted again. You're walking through a graveyard that isn't sad at all. It's almost smug. Marble angels pose like theatre performers frozen mid-bow. Stone knights lie carved in eternal sleep, swords by their sides, hands pressed politely together, as if praying for applause. The air hums with the soft gossip of memory. Some graves have flowers, others have tourists. A few have pigeons doing their best to be irreverent. You glance at the inscriptions. Names half-worn, dates half-true. It hits you. This place isn't just a cemetery. It's an audition. Tonight, you're among the ghosts of fame and infamy. You start walking, your footsteps crunching on gravel that probably once hosted royal processions. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls the hour. Its echo makes the statues seem to breathe. The first name that catches your eye is one you actually recognize. Richard III. His monument gleams a little too brightly, like someone recently polished the controversy. A mainstream fact, Richard III ruled England from 1483 to 1485. His reputation blackened by rumours that he murdered his young nephews, the princes in the tower, to secure the throne. The quirky note centuries later, when his skeleton was discovered under a Leicester parking lot in 2012. The first thing scientists noticed was that his spine was curved. Proof of scoliosis, not villainy. Historians still argue whether Shakespeare's play made him evil or merely memorable. You kneel beside his name. You know, you murmur. If parking lots could talk, yours would probably demand royalties. The wind stirs, almost like laughter. You imagine him answering, "I'd rather be famous for betrayal than forgotten for loyalty." You move on, passing tombs that glitter with titles. Count, Duke, Archbishop, someone who paid for this font. Each name hums with a different flavor of ego. Then you notice a smaller grave, modest, almost shy. The name carved on it is Hildegard of Bingen. You remember her, composer, mystic, healer, and general overachiever. A mainstream fact, Hildegard was a 12th century abbess, whose visions led to a body of theological writing, natural philosophy, and music still performed today. The quirky bit. She described her divine revelations as the living light. A shimmering glow that scholars now think might have been migraines. Historians still argue whether her genius was spiritual, medical, or simply the world's most productive headache. You whisper. You'd have loved the internet. Somewhere far away, a faint chant drifts through the air, ancient and strangely modern. As you walk, the cemetery stretches, warps, reshapes itself into a hall of portraits. The frames shimmer, each painting staring back at you like a memory trying to outlive itself. You pass Joan of Arc, armor gleaming, eyes full of fire. Then Vlad the Impaler, expression unreadable, cape unnecessarily dramatic. A mainstream fact. Both figures lived within decades of each other, and both became myths that exceeded the people they once were. The quirky connection in early French plays. Joan was sometimes portrayed as both saint and witch, depending on the audience's mood. Historians still argue whether that duality was blasphemy or just really efficient marketing. You linger before Vlad's portrait. He doesn't blink. You tilt your head. You say softly, for someone remembered as Dracula, you've got excellent posture. His mouth seems to twitch, either a smile or a smirk. Better posture than conscience, he might have said. You step back, shaking your head. Medieval PR strikes again. Further down the gallery, you find faces you don't immediately recognize. Poets who died before being published. Knights who were legends for exactly one ballad. Painters whose names outlived their signatures. The air feels thick with ambition, with the human refusal to be quietly forgotten. You reach out and brush your fingers against one cracked canvas. It's of a woman holding a quill, her eyes tired but curious. There's no nameplate. You wonder how many geniuses history misplaced, simply because they didn't fit the century's costume. A mainstream fact. Many medieval manuscripts and musical works were unsigned, especially those by women or monastic scribes. The quirky bit. Scholars sometimes identify anonymous authors by comparing handwriting quirks. One monk apparently dotted his with tiny crosses. Historians still argue whether anonymity was humility or censorship. You glance upward. If ghosts can hear me, blink twice for humility. And nothing happens, though a candle flickers suspiciously. The gallery twists again, and suddenly you're walking through a tavern. The portraits are gone, replaced by laughter, tankards, and songs that stumble around the truth. You realize this is another kind of immortality, the kind carried not by marble or ink, but melody. At a corner table, a bard is singing about a knight who killed a dragon, rescued a princess, and retired to become mayor. You've heard this tune before, just with different names. A mainstream fact oral tradition preserved much of medieval folklore and local history. The quirky tidbit. Minstrels were occasionally fined for creative exaggerations during public recitals, essentially the first cases of fake news. Historians still argue whether those songs distorted history or simply kept it interesting. You sit beside the bard and ask, "Do you believe half the things you sing?" He laughs into his owl. Believe? No. But people don't pay for facts. They pay for feelings that rhyme. He grins. And you can't help but raise your cup to that logic. When you leave the tavern, the street outside feels alive with echoes. You hear bits of ballads in the wind. Arthur, Eleanor, Robin, Becket, all the names that history refused to let go. You pass a marketplace where storytellers still trade their wares. Some sell scrolls, others sell scandals. One woman waves you over, her table covered with relics of questionable authenticity. She points to a chipped goblet. The cup of Alexander the Great, she claims proudly. You arch a brow. Wasn't he ancient, not medieval? She shrugs. Time's flexible when you're selling nostalgia. You laugh. Can't argue with that. A mainstream fact, medieval Europe adored relics. Bones, hair, garments, even holy foreskins. The quirky truth, entire pilgrimages revolved around these objects, and rival churches occasionally claimed to possess duplicates of the same saintly toe. Historians still argue whether relic culture was genuine devotion or early tourism economics. You pick up the goblet, feel its cracks under your thumb, and wonder how many lies get polished into legend, simply because people need something to believe in. The merchant smiles knowingly. People don't worship relics, she says. They worship reminders. You nod slowly. That's fair. The sun dips low, and the marketplace fades behind you. You find yourself once more among the graves, though now they glow faintly, like memories lit from within. The names shimmer kings beside beggars, heroes beside villains, all of them finally quiet, under the same indifferent stars. You pause at one grave whose inscription has worn completely away. No name, no date. Just a smooth slab of stone. And yet someone's placed a single fresh flower on it. You kneel. No fame, no infamy. You whisper, just peace. That's rare. For a long moment, the night hums softly around you. The steady breath of time, doing its best impression of forgiveness. You think of all the people you've met on this strange journey. Kings who couldn't sleep. Queens who couldn't trust. Knights chasing causes they barely understood. And artists who tried to paint the meaning of it all. You smile faintly. You all just wanted to matter, didn't you? Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmurs. A polite applause from eternity. You rise and take one last look at the glowing graves. Well, you say softly, you did. Even the forgotten ones. The air feels lighter now. The ghosts seem content. You turn away, walking toward the horizon where the darkness begins to soften into pale grey. Dawn again, or maybe the afterglow of understanding. As you walk, a last voice drifts through the wind. Fame is loud, it says, but peace whispers longer. You nod, letting that settle in your chest like a slow exhale. The graves fade, the portraits blur, and soon there's only the road ahead. You've spent so long wandering through ambition, genius, betrayal, and dust. But there's one last stop to make. The place where all stories end and all noise becomes lullaby. You breathe in, slow and steady. The world smells like sleep. You keep breathing, slow and steady, as the scent of the graveyard drifts away. It's replaced by something gentler. Warm linen, rain on stone, maybe a hint of wood smoke curling in the distance. The air softens, thick with quiet. It's the sound of history finally catching its breath. You walk along a pale road that seems to have no direction, no time attached to it. Just endless twilight. The kind of light that never hurts your eyes. That feels like a sigh you can step into. And there, at the edge of sight, sits something impossible. An ancient clock tower half swallowed by vines. The clock's hands are still. You realize that you're not moving through history anymore. You're moving through after. This is where the noise of centuries comes to rest, where crowns turn to dust and ink to silence. You're walking through the sleep of ages. The tower looms above you as you step closer. You can hear faint murmurs beneath the vines, not voices, exactly, but echoes. The vibrations of everything that's ever been said or done, still trying to fade. You touch the stone, and the texture feels like memory, rough in some places, smooth in others. Layers of time pressed against your palm. The whispers drift around you. Low and familiar, the laugh of an artist, the sigh of a queen, the quiet oath of a soldier who never got home. They circle you like drowsy fireflies, and for the first time, they don't feel heavy. They feel peaceful. You take a slow step forward, then another. The door of the tower creaks open on its own. Inside, the air smells like parchment and rain. A single candle burns in the center, its flame motionless. You walk around it carefully, tracing the carvings on the walls. Names, dates, prayers, and one small sentence scratched deeper than the rest. Sleep is history without arguments. You smile. Finally, something everyone can agree on. A mainstream fact. Medieval people viewed sleep as a sacred act, often divided into two phases. First sleep, and second sleep. They'd wake for an hour in the middle of the night to pray, write, or just think before returning to dreams. The quirky bits and monasteries even had rules about how loudly monks could snore. Historians still argue whether segmented sleep was healthier or simply a symptom of drafty castles. You sit beside the candle, letting your body sink into the rhythm of stillness. The air hums with centuries of exhaustion. Somewhere outside, you hear soft footsteps. The ghosts of everyone you've met on this strange, drowsy pilgrimage. Kings still pacing through their regrets. Scholars whispering equations to the stars. Alchemists chasing perfection, even in eternity. But they're slower now. Gentler. The sharp edges of ambition have worn down to round, sleepy curves. You close your eyes and let them pass by. The world tilts again, but not abruptly this time. It glides, like a ship turning on calm water. You're standing on a shore made of starlight and old stories. Each grain of sand glows faintly, and when you kneel to pick one up, you see an image flicker, inside it a medieval city waking at dawn. A knight laying down his sword. A monk writing the last word of a forgotten book. Every story, tiny but complete. You let the sand slip through your fingers. Good night, you whisper, though you're not sure who you're talking to anymore. Maybe to all of them, maybe to yourself. A mainstream fact. Medieval monks often ended their day with the prayer, compline, from the Latin completorium, the completion. It was meant as both a closing ritual and a surrender. The quirky details some monks sang it while lying flat on the cold floor, symbolizing both rest and mortality. Historians still argue whether that was devotion or just a good excuse to lie down early. You stretch out your legs, mimic the gesture, and let your body rest against the soft glow of time. The ground beneath you hums with warmth. You realize the tower's candlelight isn't fading, it's spreading. The walls themselves begin to shimmer, their carvings glowing gently until they dissolve into starlit dust. The whole structure melts upward, transforming into constellations, every stone a forgotten story finding its place among the stars. You stand and look up. Above you, the night sky is thick with meaning. You can almost read it like a manuscript. The lines of heroes and healers, tyrants and tricksters, all rewritten into something softer, more forgiving. Historians still argue. You murmur, repeating that familiar phrase. But the stars don't. You laugh quietly. Guess they're better editors. The breeze shifts, carrying with it the faint smell of ink and roses. The stars pulse once, twice, as if nodding goodnight. You take a slow step forward and find yourself walking into the light between worlds. The road is gone now. There's no need for it anymore. Your breath deepens. The world becomes a hush. And now, as the last whisper of history settles, it's time to let go of remembering. So here you are, at the quiet end of everything. The candle's out, the pages have closed, and all that's left is the hum of your own heartbeat, gentle and steady, like a drum that's finally learned the rhythm of calm. You take a breath, deep, slow, easy. The air tastes soft, like rain after a long heat. Every sound you've heard tonight, from clashing swords to scribbling pens, has thinned to a single, peaceful thread of silence. The ghosts have gone home. The kings are sleeping under stone. The scholars are dreaming in ink. The alchemists are somewhere mixing starlight and patience. The world, for once, has stopped asking questions. You feel it, don't you? That warm pull at the edge of your awareness. The sense that even time itself is curling up, resting its weary hands. The night has grown tender now, like a story that's realized it doesn't need to prove anything anymore. Let your shoulders drop. Let your eyes grow heavy. The noise, the centuries, the names, they all fade into a single, slow exhale. You've walked through wars and whispers, through genius and guilt, through the echoes of everyone who ever wanted to matter. And now, the only thing that matters is rest. So breathe again. A little slower this time. Feel the quiet settle into you like velvet. The stars are still out there, keeping watch. But they're in no rush. You've got all the time in the world to sleep.